Jujutsu Kaisen and Demon Slayer are two of the most popular battle shonen of the last decade, and two stories that I've historically pit against one another. And today, I'll be throwing all of Jujutsu Kaisen versus all of Demon Slayer in order to see which verse is superior. Throughout this video, I'm going to be taking you guys through matchups that I've covered on the channel before that act as good markers for comparison between stories, comparing not only the protagonists, but their antagonist group, and even the respective strongest characters in the universe against one another in order to see which verse is stronger in an escalating tier of power and ability. For fans of the channel that may have seen some of these videos before, I'll be adding sections after each video discussing some things I may have missed, as well as responding to the most popular comments and sentiments under each video, just to give you guys a fresh and updated take on these matchups. For everyone else, new or old, just kick back and relax as we dive into each world's power, starting with the first ever video I made on this topic, my first rendition of Yuji Itadori versus Tanjiro Kamado. Tanjiro's strength and power wavers quite a bit throughout the series, with his best quantifiable AP feats for a while coming from his boulder slice as early as chapter 5, and his ability to cut upper moon demons like Gyutaro and Daki put him ambiguously above that level of scaling. Now, up to about season 2, this would mean that Tanjiro caps out pretty hard at building level, which isn't all that impressive in the grand scheme of things. However, I will say that he does get a significant upgrade in scaling based on his relativity or superiority to higher level upper moon demons like Akaza and Doma in the final arcs of Demon Slayer. Doma in particular has an ice creation feat that has been calced to require anywhere from 70 to 300 tons worth of force, putting him and everyone that scales to him anywhere between city block and multi-city block level. Now, Tanjiro never gets to face off against Doma personally. However, based on many of the fights that we see in the manga, including the Akaza rematch and fight against Muzan, I think it's fair to say that by the end of the series, Tanjiro should at least be relative to the second upper moon demon. His ability to decimate Akaza once he entered the see-through world, and his impressive showings against Muzan all lead me to believe that he should at least scale to this level of power, and in fact should likely be a bit stronger when he's at his peak in every regard. Tanjiro's durability shouldn't be too far off from his AP, considering he survived attacks from Akaza and Muzan as well, placing his durability in the city block to multi-city block range, just like his attack potency. And while the strength and durability of Tanjiro ends up being quite clear-cut, no pun intended, his speed, on the other hand, gets a little bit weird to scale. You see, on one hand, we have numerous statements supporting the idea that characters in Demon Slayer can move like lightning, or that they are lightning timers. Zenitsu, when using thunder breathing, is implied to move as fast as a clap of thunder, and Tanjiro, when doing the same thing, is just verbatim stated to move like lightning. However, we also get contradicting feats like Tanjiro getting blitzed by bolts of lightning, Upper Moon 4 being hit with bullets even after being aware of the attack, Tanjiro getting blitzed by sound-based demon arts, Kanroji getting blitzed by sound-based demon arts, and in general, characters who should scale above early Zenitsu being caught numerous times by attacks moving at the speed of sound. Initially, I just thought Demon Slayer had some trash speed scaling, but then you see the same Kanroji who actually gets tagged by sound-based attacks being able to dodge and avoid lightning within the same fight, and it definitely becomes a little bit confusing as to how fast these characters are and what the author is intending to put on display here. It shouldn't really even be possible for someone like Kanroji to be touched by sound-based attacks since she is able to dodge and slice things like lightning because of the 300 times speed difference between the speed of sound and lightning itself. Getting hit by sound as a lightning timer would be the equivalent of you being able to dodge bullets but then getting speed blitzed by a really fast baseball pitch. That is to say, it's really weird and somewhat inconsistent. However, since this only happens to her one time in this fight, you could argue that she was simply not as on guard, or that this feat is an outlier since it necessarily contradicts higher scaling that she could potentially have. And after a little bit of thought and conferring with some people very familiar with the manga scaling, that is the conclusion that I came to, that Kanroji and anybody that scales to her should at least be a lightning timer. Now, at the time these feats are being made, Tanjiro doesn't scale to them, even remotely. In fact, Tanjiro at this point in the series is pretty slow, to the point where he doesn't ever really get faster than Hantengu's sound-based demon art. But we know from later arcs in the series that Tanjiro gains power rivaling, if not surpassing, that of a Hashira, and Kanroji is pretty consistently shown to be one of the weakest Hashira throughout the series. Tanjiro also has superior showings against a stronger demon in the final stretches of the series, making it pretty clear once more that he is indeed superior to these lightning speed feats by the series end. This would place him around Mach 300 and give him a pretty solid base for his combat and reaction speed. Moving on from the physical department, we can talk about Tanjiro's techniques, and in spite of how simple he may seem, he actually has some pretty decent hacks and abilities at his disposal. Obviously, he has his swordsman skill and general level of martial arts competence, but we see that through the use of smell, Tanjiro is able to not only find the best way to attack an opponent, but he is also able to predict the movements of his opponent to the point of entering the realm of precognition. His body has to be able to keep up with the actual information he is receiving, of course, which is why we see that he can get blitzed, but this ability to see slightly into the future by properly predicting movements has proven to be very useful to Tanjiro in battle. Through the use of breathing styles, Tanjiro is able to string together a variety of attacks and create supernatural effects such as after images, slightly heal himself, and amp his leg and arm strength to overclock the normal limits of his abilities. This overclocking is taken to the extreme when Tanjiro activates his Slayer mark. The first time we actually see it used, Tanjiro in his head tries to summon 100 times his normal strength, and many people take this statement very literally. However, I am somewhat skeptical of this being hyperbole. Regardless of that possibility though, the amp from the Slayer mark is very blatantly demonstrated in the series numerous times, and it cannot be denied as a useful tool for Tanjiro in battle. And when at his best in the manga, Tanjiro is able to enter the see-through world, which enhances his precognitive abilities numerous times over, and allows him to see the internal workings of whoever he is fighting. Entering the see-through world does take a massive toll on Tanjiro's stamina, but the benefits of using this form are well worth the risk. Now, with Tanjiro having been Okay, wow. Kinda crazy to go back this far and see what I was on back then, but there are a few corrections or at least clarifications that I'd like to make regarding points upscaling in this video. As the oldest matchup in regards to Jujutsu Kaisen and Demon Slayer on the channel, I end up revisiting this matchup a bit later and addressing some of the issues that I have with the scaling, so I'll quickly touch on those and then leave it to future or past me to make those adjustments. First off, despite arguing in favor of Tanjiro winning here, I think I downplayed him pretty hard. Arguing in favor of building level feats being some of the best that he could present in the verse until the final arc of the story, and while I later went on to consider him multi-city block due to Doma scaling, that's still a pretty egregious lowball in my eyes. I'll go in more depth in a bit, as Tanjiro is just a high-tier Demon Slayer character who scales to or above most in the verse. The placement of his strength should be much closer to town levels due to his ability to deal with Gyutaro and Daki in combat, with the former pulling off a town level feat in his dying moments. Speed-wise, Tanjiro should also be significantly faster than what I stated, not only because of Kanroji's lightning avoidance happening before a Hashira training arc, but also because in the Red Light District arc itself, Daki reacts to explosions set off by Tengen, and Tanjiro shows himself capable of combating or even surpassing her speed several-fold with a Rage Amp. So yeah, I did Tanjiro a little dirty here. I also glazed Yuji's strength and durability just a bit, just because of the domain creation scaling that I used to hold a bit more staunchly to. It's not impossible to use by any means, but I think that the higher mountain or even island levels of strength achieved through those means alone isn't necessarily as consistent with disaster curse tier characters as I had thought at the time. In reality, even if these domains required this amount of energy to open, all that would mean is that Jujutsu Kaisen characters can expend their power in a massive burst to create these pocket realms, and it wouldn't necessarily correlate to their attack potency in combat outside of that. The reason for that is pretty simple too. Domains are the pinnacle of sorcery. Even maximum techniques are said to pale in comparison. So what a character can pull off in their domain creation can reasonably vastly outscale their base attacks, and this is consistent with technique usage with one's domain being increased to 120%. Overall, I just don't really agree with the logic I was using for the domain creation. This isn't even to say that Jujutsu Kaisen AP scaling can get a little wild and wacky when you get into the higher tiers. Trust me, we'll be getting into some of those higher levels soon. The domain scaling is just not the best way to go about it. In all honesty, I view using the creation of domains for attack potency now in the same light as I do light speed JJK speed scaling. It's technically possible to do, pull off, and even make a somewhat coherent argument for, but it's quite inconsistent with the general level of strength shown and not concrete enough to say with 100% confidence that I at least still hold to this idea. It's a sufficient high ball for Itadori, but I think he'd just be a bit stronger and more durable than Tanjiro in those town to large town levels of power due to Arame and Ishigori calcs. By the story's end, he should be relative to Yu and Hikari, who face off against these characters for long stretches of time, or even just blatantly defeat them. So Yuji following suit isn't too crazy, but we'll get into that more in the second round of this topic. The elephant in the room when it came to this video was the fact that I didn't talk about Yuji's techniques or showings outside of physicals, and that's simply because he didn't have them at the time, which prompted me to remake the video that you just watched, and you'll see that a bit later as well. Overall, this video was very much a product of its time and outcome, presentation, knowledge, and information that we had present. You'll get to see a fully realized version of my thoughts on this fight in a bit, but before we have our main characters fight again, let's cleanse our palates a little bit to see how Demon Slayer's resident sleepyhead Thunder God stacks up against Jujutsu Kaisen's strongest farmer and God of Lightning. Zenitsu Agamatsu and Hajime Kashimo, two characters wielding the power of thunder and lightning respectively, and two combatants representative of Demon Slayer and Jujutsu Kaisen alike. As I've been doing with the previous videos on the channel, I'll be throwing all of these characters' abilities against one another in order to determine who would win. Jujutsu Kaisen's God of Lightning, or the Demon Slayer who tamed thunder. As always, I'll be kicking this discussion off by going over both characters' strength, speed, and durability. And there's no better place to start than with Zenitsu's showings in the Demon Slayer universe. Throughout the story, it's consistently shown that Zenitsu's speed is his bread and butter above all else. So counter to how I usually present a character scaling, I'm actually going to start with that stat. From his introduction, Zenitsu has been shown to very casually move faster than sound, creating thunderous sonic booms through his movement speed alone. Well, usually I wouldn't even bother mentioning a feat like this because it's so low relative to his peak scalability. I think it's important to note that Zenitsu's default should be compared to that of thunder, as the effects of total concentration breathing aren't real, or at least the visual ones aren't. We can't use how Zenitsu is depicted visually to be the end-all be-all of placing him within those lightning timer tiers, and due to his limited pool of feats, you might find it hard to place him there at all. He does fight really well against Daki in the Red Light District arc, pretty consistently avoiding her attacks while using his normal breathing style, and is even able to blitz her when entering God Speed mode, which should place him well over 200 times faster than sound at his peak during this time in the story. We're able to determine this figure, by the way, because Daki is able to react to and place herself in between Gyutaro and an already detonating set of explosives, which, when calculated, comes out to that aforementioned Mach 200 figure. Typically, it's at this point in the video where I'd say that this is just a low-end feat for Zenitsu, and he obviously scales to Kanroji, or Uzui, or whoever else that should be relative to this tier of character, but you honestly can't say that with a whole lot of certainty, even by the manga's conclusion. Unlike with many of the other Demon Slayer characters mentioned, Zenitsu doesn't have the definitive scaling necessary to place him in the same upper tiers in the same way that the Elite Hashira, Upper Moons, and Tanjiro do, and this fact greatly affects how high we can scale him. His only major fight after the Red Light District comes in the way of his showdown with Kaigaku, Upper Moon 6, and a demon that is only there because he rose through the unfilled ranks of prior demons dying, at least if Zenitsu is to be believed here. This not only means that the use of linear Upper Moon chain scaling is pretty useless, but we also can't even compare him directly to Uzui, who struggled to fight against another Upper Moon of this rank, because it's implied he doesn't possess the strength to get here naturally. Zenitsu is able to defeat Kaigaku in the end, bringing out his very own thunder breathing style to do so, but it's quite obvious that these two fighters are near equals, and Zenitsu shouldn't be able to handily face off against anyone above this level. This is even further substantiated when we learn that Kaigaku still hadn't mastered the use of his own techniques and demon arts, possibly resulting in a victory that was only achieved over a fledgling Upper 6. You may argue that the narrative and in-universe purpose behind the Hashira training was to get the cast at a level that could consistently contend with Upper Moons and Hashira alike. Therefore, Zenitsu should at least scrape the floor of this tier, and while I agree with the notion, it's obvious that some got a greater boost than others from this training. Despite going through the same training as Tanjiro, he doesn't get a Slayer mark, access to the see-through world, Red Blade, or feats that even vaguely imply he could throw down with the likes of Upper 3 to the same extent that Tanjiro was capable of. And if that weren't enough, the difference in power and combat ability between Hashira can be a significant gap, as illustrated with the likes of Kanroji and Gyome and their relative performances in Infinity Castle and the Muzan battle. So no matter how you slice it, Zenitsu's greatest calculable and scalable feats come in the way of his fight with Daki. But what about the Muzan fight, right? Surely Zenitsu accrued some good scaling here. Well, to be completely honest with you, not really when you put everything into context. Zenitsu and Inosuke join the battle against Muzan quite late into the climactic showdown, and do so much fresher than any of their allies, meaning the few slashes and slices that Zenitsu does get in here or there don't necessarily mean he's equal to anyone else on the battlefield. Muzan throughout the night is continuously weakening. It takes Zenitsu's strongest move to even land attacks with some level of oomph behind them, and he's consistently fighting alongside others who can pull aggro when needed. So you can't really determine that he scales to this weakened Muzan, you can't determine that he scales to the others on the battlefield, and as such, it's just kind of a vague feat that doesn't really mean much for the end-all be-all. Because of this, Mach 200 plus is about the limit of Zenitsu's speed scaling. This limited pool of feats he has also pretty severely affects his ceiling in the strength department. Normally, I just use Gyutaro's destruction of the Red Light District to justify town level scaling for his attack potency, but Zenitsu has shown nothing to prove he's on this level. Sure, he fights well against Daki, but she's shown time and time again to be the weaker of the siblings, and even in that case, he's not able to slice through her neck alone. He requires the combined help of Inosuke to accomplish accomplish this task, and it's not like he ever fights someone explicitly stronger or higher ranked than Gyutaro, so you can't even use indirect lines of scaling to place him there. Some of the other hallmark feats like Rengoku and Akaza's Clash or Doma's Ice Statue creation would also normally be applicable to any character discussed in a video like this, but once again, Zenitsu has no real frame of reference to get there. He never fights Akaza or Doma directly, nor does he pull off a showing of strength so impressive that it's obvious he's fighting in the same realm as them. And once again, defaulting to Muzan feats doesn't really work. When Muzan is getting consistently weaker, Zenitsu is bringing out his strongest attacks and he still isn't able to leave much of an impact. I mean, at the bare minimum, he's a lot stronger than unnamed or irrelevant demons that have like building level scaling, so that's something, right? Okay, I'm kind of hoeing him. With a little bit of charitability and some pity in your heart, I'm not gonna lie, you can't do much with this guy. Maybe you could put him at city block level if you think that Rengoku by the story's end just kind of gets power cliffed out of relevance. Rengoku being able to clash with Akaza with an attack that's placed in the city block ranges, but even this is a bit dubious and vague in how you make the connection. Zenitsu pretty arguably can be said to be in the city block ranges, maybe, I guess just off the general level of power shown in the later stages of Demon Slayer, but this isn't a particularly ironclad stance, nor is it a great comparison to his fellow Slayers, and the thing is, his durability scaling is even more in the toilet than his attack potency. Unfortunately for him, most Demon Slayer characters don't have equal parts durability and strength, at least if you're a human, as shown with Tanjiro on numerous occasions, Rengoku in his fight with Akaza, and pretty much every other demon versus human battle in the series. While they can block attacks and slash with extreme amounts of force, their unguarded physical bodies can't seem to handle the same toll, so Zenitsu's resilience would just be vaguely below his attack potency. As for notable abilities and techniques with Zenitsu, you get what you see on the box. All of his breathing style's focus is directed towards speedy attacks and quick draw techniques. With his Godspeed and Honoi Kazuchi no Kami, he's able to blitz characters that under normal circumstances would be relative to him, and while his original thunder breathing form isn't explicitly said to have a usage limit, Zenitsu notes that he can't push himself to use Godspeed more than 3 times in battle, and I imagine the 7th form of thunder breathing being quite similar. A straightforward speedster if I've ever seen one, and soon we'll see if that speed will be enough to defeat the god of lightning. Kashimo can be somewhat of a controversial figure in the Jujutsu Kaisen community because of his interesting exit from the series, but don't let his reputation fool you. He's definitely one of the higher tiered characters in the greater context of Jujutsu Kaisen, especially when talking on the basis of physical abilities. In terms of Kashimo's strength and durability, placing him in the town levels of power is relatively simple. Of his 2 major fights, the one that takes place with Akari is most important for this idea, with Ishigori being the origin point of this calculation and line of scaling. Ishigori's Granite Blasts have town level scaling based on the destruction caused in Sendai. Yuta tanks those attacks on numerous occasions, or at least survives them with a high level of physical cohesion after the fact. Hikari and Yuta are implied to be within the same tier of strength to one another, and Kashimo doles out damage to Hikari consistently within their battle, as well as surviving all of Hikari's attacks with pretty little injuries to speak of. And to top it all off, I mean, he beat 3rd form Panda, so he might actually be top 1 in the verse. The potency of his discharge lightning surpasses that of his physical blows leaps and bounds as well. Not necessarily to a degree that's easy or even possible to calculate, but even with Akari's curse energy reserves and physical body withstanding attacks from Kashimo, at every point of lightning making contact, Akari's durability was completely exceeded, and whatever part of his body was hit pretty much exploded on impact. And this is somewhat consistent with the Bolt of Lightning being the attack to push Sukuna to unveil his Heian era body in chapter 237. Even if you're relative in power to Kashimo up close, so long as he's able to charge and subsequently land his lightning against you, the fight is pretty much guaranteed to be over. Speed-wise, Kashimo is much more of a mixed bag. While in base, he has the ability to launch attacks that are as fast as lightning. As discussed before, when it comes to his own physical attack and reaction speed, things get a bit more tricky. His relativity to Hikari might imply that he's a lightning timer as well, as the gambling addict seems capable of at least visually registering and reacting to bolts of lightning at close range and diffusing its cursed energy outside of his body. If you take this to mean each character should be reacting and responding to each other at that speed, then Kashimo would scale to his own attacks, although I personally believe there are a few flaws in the logic that need to be accounted for. For starters, This discharge of energy is pretty consistently shown to punch above Kashimo's weight class. It's why it's such an effective ability in the first place, so having Kashimo be able to move at a similar speed somewhat contradicts its narrative and in-universe utilization. The second issue stems from the nature of Akari's reaction. Sure, he's able to snort out the excess cursed energy before it blows his brain up, but that's not really indicative of the rate at which he's able to throw punches, you know? All it means is that his perception and manipulation of cursed energy can keep up with lightning up close, not really that he's throwing punches or weaving his head back and forth that quickly. So if you're uncomfortable with, or straight up don't align with the leaps of logic made in order to get this higher tier scaling, Kashimo doesn't really move relatively to his lightning. This goes doubly true in his base form. More consistently, he'd probably exist in the vaguely faster than sound purgatory that most of the Jujutsu Kaisen cast find themselves in. Even in base, Kashimo should be physically relative with most of the heavy hitters based on his performance against Akari, and by the end of the story, they should all view piercing blood speed as child's play. Along with the numerous gunfire reactions we see throughout the manga, it's clear that they don't view sound attacks as the end-all be-all. Calculations on where he and his contemporaries would be exactly varies, but anywhere from 1 to 10 times the speed of sound works as a solid low-end scale for Kashimo's combat ability. With Mythic Beast Amber, you could argue that he has maybe a blitz level difference in speed above his previous self, at least based on how he almost instantly overwhelms Sukuna physically when transforming. He's also stated in this form to surpass the limits of mankind, a sentiment that doesn't really go anywhere or mean all that much comparatively when we see a member of the same species go blow for blow with him in that battle. You could argue that this statement is mostly in reference to normal humans, i.e. not Gojo or Sukuna, but even that doesn't do much to push him into a whole new tier of speed because he was already pretty relative to the likes of Yuta, Hikari, Yuji, and Maki in the speed department. Even if you don't think he beats them, he's kind of in that general area. For what it's worth, he seems somewhat relative to Heian-era Sukuna up close with his curse technique unleashed, mostly getting battered due to the difference in limbs. And if we take this to be true and scale him accordingly, he could get all the way up to Mach 60, riding off the coattails of Sukuna dodging piercing blood. Somewhat of a weaker argument though, because it's hard to pin down just how seriously Sukuna is taking this fight. And that's something that you always have to consider when scaling another Jujutsu Kaisen character to him. Sukuna's power tends to fluctuate with his whims and excitement, so unless explicitly stated, like with Maki, or pretty obviously denoted through the narrative, like with Gojo, it's extremely hard to prove that anyone is Sukuna's physical equal, even if they don't perform that badly against him. Mythic Beast Amber doesn't just exist to give him a boost in power though. Kashimo's curse technique grants him access to every phenomenon produced by electricity, and it's largely used to create resonant sound waves and irradiating electromagnetic blasts, which should be as fast as light itself. In bringing that up, I'm sure I've opened the light speed JJK can of worms, but even if you're under the impression that Sukuna is fast enough to deal with attacks on that level, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, it's very difficult to prove that Kashimo's physical abilities would scale as well. Sukuna's attacks and cursed energy are able to overwhelm him even in his strongest form, so irrespective of Sukuna's relation to light, Kashimo probably shouldn't be there. Much like Zenitsu, Kashimo's arsenal is rather limited and straightforward, and in scaling his physicals, I've touched on just about everything in his kit. Lightning manipulation to a very high degree, and potentially inhuman levels of speed paired with sonic and light blasts. In many ways, these two characters have shown themselves to be somewhat unorthodox or strange in how they're scaled or what skills they possess in comparison to my other Demon Slayer and Jujutsu Kaisen matchups. Zenitsu, while quick on the draw, lacks the definitive feats of strength that many of his comrades do in the very same manga, and Kashimo comparatively possesses the statistical highs of most Jujutsu Kaisen characters, but lacks what is maybe the most useful ability unique to the verse, being the domain expansion. As keen listeners may have picked up, Kashimo isn't anywhere near as fast as Zenitsu when taking a more measured and conservative approach to viewing his speed scaling, being anywhere from 3 to 200 times slower than Zenitsu in fact. Typically, a Jujutsu Kaisen character in one of these videos would have a domain expansion to negate the speed difference, or even a technique like Idle Transfiguration or Infinity to sidestep the need for relative speed altogether. But Kashimo has nothing of the sort. In fact, Kashimo doesn't even demonstrate the capacity to heal himself with reverse curse technique, meaning any lethal damage taken over the course of the fight will prove to be enough to end it. All of these factors combined may lead you to believe that Zenitsu has this fight in the bag, but our resident sleepyhead has some shortcomings of his own, namely being his attack potency. Even when being generous, Zenitsu's sword strikes should not have much of an effect on Kashimo, if any at all. In fact, the gap between their strength and durability is as insurmountable as the difference in speed. If Kashimo were to land any significant strike, the fight would be over in that very moment. This stalemate of attack potency and speed begs the question of who wins despite it all. And to that question, I say it depends. Assuming we take both fighters in their most narratively consistent presentation, Kashimo would rather die than use his technique on anyone not named Sukuna, which means he's limited to his base form. His attacks would be avoided pretty easily by Zenitsu, but Zenitsu's sword strikes would be pretty much like feathers to Kashimo's body, if we're being completely honest. As far as I'm concerned, what breaks the deadlock between these two are Kashimo's lightning bolts and cursed energy trait. Well, it's typically shown that the cursed energy trait one is born with is produced or demonstrated when attacking. We see on 2 separate occasions that Kashimo's lightning can be discharged even if he's the one getting attacked. In chapter 186, the beginning of Kashimo and Hikari's bout, we see that Hikari is electrified, though only slightly because of his reserves. It's important to make note of this because up to this point, Kashimo hasn't actually hit Hikari yet. He's only taken damage, yet he's still surprised by the fact Hikari isn't more negatively impacted by his trait. The conclusion that we can draw based off this fact is that Kashimo should be able to build up a charge whether or not he's the one attacking or being attacked. Chapter 188 substantiates this. After another failed attempt to kill Hikari with his lightning, Kashimo gets pelted by attacks from Hikari, who isn't expecting him to be able to launch another bolt. And if you go from this sequence page by page, we see that Kashimo does not land another attack until the second lightning bolt of the chapter strikes Hikari in the torso, rather definitively proving that even sustaining damage through physical contact would allow Kashimo to build a charge. This fact is absolutely critical to this battle because it means that Zenitsu's inability to kill Kashimo in one attack, or even put his life in danger with his slashes, would result in Kashimo charging up an adequate amount of power to discharge a bolt that would one-shot Zenitsu. The Mach 300 speed of lightning eclipsing his calculable speed in the manga. Even if you argue that Zenitsu's god speed is essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card, he can only do that a few times and would continue to exhaust himself in the process until Kashimo secures the victory, or Kashimo could do the same maneuver that he did against Hikari, setting up his staff in between himself and Zenitsu so that the lightning bolt happens from behind, off guarding him, despite the speed difference. This outcome only becomes more cemented the more grace you give Kashimo, or if you allow him to use Mythic Beast Amber. In the event that Kashimo is truly a lightning timer, then that means he's capable of just outspeeding and absolutely pummeling Zenitsu in close quarters combat. With or without this grace though, Zenitsu also loses to Mythic Beast Amber, just on the basis of the light beam alone. Even the most generous interpretation imaginable for Zenitsu doesn't allow him to react to an attack like this, and he most certainly doesn't have the durability to outright tank it. I won't lie to you, when making this video, I expected Zenitsu's speed to be an equalizing factor that would make this fight become one based on attrition, which, to be completely honest, Zenitsu would probably win due to the Hashira training showings and generally Demon Slayer characters having a lot of good stamina feats. But when I discovered that Kashimo's Cursed Energy trait worked both offensively and defensively, it became clear that his victory would be assured no matter what. But I guess it shouldn't be a surprise that lightning beats out thunder. Zenitsu Agatsuma. Zenitsu Agatsuma. Zenitsu Agatsuma. I promise y'all I know his name. I just flubbed it and I didn't notice it when I was editing. Aside from this crazy oversight though, honestly, I kind of nailed this one. Kashimo and Zenitsu do kind of just gap each other in the respective strength and speed department. Many of the comments under this video somewhat ridiculed the idea of Zenitsu being that fast and also somehow that slow. Generally speaking, he doesn't have the high tier scaling to any character well beyond Upper Moon 6 in overall ability, barely taking on Daki and Kaigaku, two demons who have pretty big asterisks next to their rank due to various circumstances. Because of this, while he'd be faster than Kashimo, he wouldn't outscale the bolts of lightning that he can fire off, and this is just pretty narratively consistent in the Demon Slayer story. Many people argued in the exact opposite direction of this as well, appealing to the fact that Demon Slayers are just humans with breathing techniques, bro, and therefore shouldn't have superhuman capabilities, but like, this is just blatantly untrue and not really rooted in the text we're discussing. While the visual effects of breathing styles are imaginary, yes, the demons they fight aren't, and neither are the incredible feats of strength and agility. While he isn't isn't powerful enough to beat Kashimo. I think on the opposite end of that, it's quite silly to pretend Zenitsu or any relevant Demon Slayer character is remotely close to being a regular human. This is definitely a video I stand by in terms of outcome and reasoning, which will allow us to move on to what might be my most controversial video covering the topic of Jujutsu Kaisen characters versus the Demon Slayer cast, with the disaster curses going up against the upper moons. Two popular battle shonen, two villain groups, and one winner. Today, I'll be pitting the disaster curse spirits of Jujutsu Kaisen up against Demon Slayer's upper moons in order to determine who would come out on top. If you checked out my last two videos discussing Muzan versus Jujutsu Kaisen and Sukuna versus Demon Slayer, you know what you're in for. First, I'll give a brief breakdown of both sides' physical stats and abilities before discussing how these variables and characters would interact, and most importantly, who would win. Starting by going over the broad strokes of the upper moons is relatively easy. Having discussed Demon Slayer so frequently in the past few weeks makes this a pretty simple task because they by and large scale to a majority of the high-end feats that this verse has to offer. Speed-wise, even low-end upper moons like Daki and Gyutaro should be massively hypersonic. As we see in their battle with Uzui, Daki's able to react to the explosive launched by the Hashira and shield her brother before they reach him. As the lowest ranked demons in this category, with the exception of Kaigaku due to his unique circumstances, this means that every demon that'll be fighting is at least 200 plus times faster than sound, as the calc I'm referencing concludes. This isn't all though, as Hatengu is shown summoning bolts of lightning that Mitsuri, well before developing her mark and going through Hashira training, is capable of avoiding rather consistently. Mitsuri can be reacted to by Hatengu at multiple points in this fight, meaning that not only should he scale relative to a character that can casually avoid bolts of lightning, but upper moons 1 through 3 should be well beyond that. This is pretty consistent with Akaza, Doma, and Kokushibo's displays during the Infinity Castle arc as well. Not only are they capable of defeating multiple Hashira level fighters at the same time, but they perform this well against characters that have become unquantifiably stronger in the interim. Slayer marks on their own increase the user's strength by several times, and while I can't put an exact number on how much stronger the training made them, the top 3 demons discussed today should make lightning timers look like snails by comparison. Gyoko, Hatengu, and Nakime should all at least be lightning timers, and Gyutaro and Daki would be well below that, but still over 200 times faster than sound based on the previously established reasoning. Now, it's often brought up to shut down this line of logic that Muzan got caught in an explosion, and because he scales above all of the upper moons in Hashira, this necessitates that his scaling is invalid. The problem with this as a rebuttal, however, is that Muzan simply wasn't expecting combat in this moment. This is a prime example of an off-guard showing. Ubuyashiki was doing all he could to sit upright, and with his senses, Muzan didn't detect any Hashira in the area. Getting caught in an explosion in a moment of hubris and surprise doesn't discount the pretty consistent feats shown before and after this, and this is just consistent with Muzan's own thoughts and statements, as he says that he expected something, but not an explosion that would engulf not only himself, but Ubuyashiki, his family, and the entire estate. As far as I'm concerned, attempting to limit Demon Slayer based on this feat is akin to scaling all of Dragon Ball up to this point to bullet level, because an off-guard and rusty Goku took some damage from a 9mm. At worst, it's an outlier that goes against a general trend of speed scaling shown in the series, and in the best, most reasonable scenario, it's just a villain letting his guard down in a moment where he thought victory was assured. Strength and durability wise, the upper moons should scale anywhere between town and large town level. This is based on Gyutaro's destruction of the red light district with his blood blades. When calculated, this feat is shown to require enough energy to destroy a large town, and as the weakest upper moon, Gyutaro would defer to every other character in terms of output. One could argue that this level of strength is only achievable with Blood Demon Arts, and I wouldn't actually say that's too far-fetched, at least in Upper Moon 6's case. During the battle in the Red Light District, Gyutaro's Blood Blade attacks are shown to pose a significantly greater threat than anything else pulled off. Even the Slayers capable of cutting him and his sister down are surprised consistently by these. Physically, you can make the argument that they aren't quite as strong, but Demon Arts at the higher level are so integrated to an Upper Moon's fighting style, the distinction between that and their physicality is pretty irrelevant here. Durability wise, they should be pretty comparable to the attack potency of their blood demon arts, as the demon slayers they fight are capable of warding off their attacks physically, but require an even greater level of exertion to cut their enemies down. In the unique abilities and hacks department, the upper moons are actually quite diverse. I'll dive into the specifics of characters that have some interesting win cons when I go over the outcome of this fight, but for the time being, the basics of being a demon are pretty easy to understand. Infinite stamina, incredible regeneration speed, and unique blood demon arts are par for the course with demons of this caliber. These arts can achieve anything from spatial manipulation to control of the elements, but like I said, I'll talk about how that factors into everything in a bit. Before that, let's talk about what the disaster curses got going on. Unlike the upper moons, these curses are the mid-game antagonists, meaning in a lot of ways they don't get access to the higher tiered scaling that many late game JJK characters do. This affects them most negatively when discussing and scaling their speed in particular. Jujutsu Kaisen is already a verse that's notoriously slow relative to other battle shonen of its ilk, but what you're able to realistically and consistently scale mid-tier characters like Mahito and Jogo to, even when being generous, is kinda sad. You have some okay feats and calcs to pull on if you reference Yuji's dodging of piercing blood, and scale that back to Mahito, who fights and performs extremely well against an even more locked-in Itadori with the help of Todo and Boogie Woogie. Jogo should at least be comparable to this due to being able to perception blitz characters like Maki and Nanami, who, while slower than Yuji, shouldn't have a gap that massive. Maybe you'd also want to throw Hanami in there just for performing well against Yuji and Todo in the Goodwill event, although that's a bit dubious due to Yuji's steady and continuous growth throughout the manga. This almost embarrassingly gives the disaster curses a high end of being vaguely faster than sound, anywhere from 1 to 10 times if you wanted a numerical estimate. Feats like Hikari reacting to lightning or Sukuna dodging EM waves, regardless of the ambiguity of both showings, wouldn't scale back to any of them for one of two reasons. The first is found in the Hikari example, as it's pretty much impossible to link these two in any way. Kashimo doesn't fight anyone that scales to them, and neither does Hikari. The second lies with Sukuna, and that's just because even if you do believe Sukuna is fast enough to react to light, he's so much faster than any of the characters being discussed that it's honestly an irrelevant piece of trivia. Now, you could go one step further and really hammer home some downplay if for some reason you had a deep-seated hatred for this group of curses. For example, the fact that Kamo calls Curse Naoya faster than anything, and Curse Naoya's top speed statement puts him at a whopping Mach 3, that could certainly limit the back half of the group like Dagon and Hanami. And while I usually argue against the validity and consistency of this statement, in this instance there isn't really much ground to stand on. Neither the Curse of the Sea nor the Earth have any feats that call consistency into question. It gets even worse if you use Naoya's base form performance against Yuji and subsonic plus projection sorcery statement in his fight with Maki. As in his introduction battles, through the use of his technique, he's able to blitz a Yuji that Choso considers significantly stronger than the version he fought, and goes on to have a statement placing his max speed at vaguely faster than sound, which is corroborated by another statement from Maki later in the manga. What's crazy is, due to the way Gege went about writing it, you can't even use a disingenuous but possible uncapped, well, faster than sound doesn't just mean 1 times faster, because the fact that Maki was caught off guard by what's said to be a Mach 3 attack means his original speed was well below that. Oh my god, Gege, when I catch you for doing this to my series, man. Anyway, the subsonic stuff is less consistent due to piercing blood feats being pretty abundant, with Naoya even having some himself, but I emphasize this speed scaling in the hopes that everyone makes note of the quantities mentioned for both parties. If the disaster curses are able to make anything shake, it won't be because they're blitzing their opponents. Strength and output wise, the Curse Spirits are able to put up a bit more of a fight. Even up till the end of the series, someone like Jogo in particular at his strongest should still be a pretty high tier character when isolating pure destructive force. Not only does Kusakabe note the power of Sukuna's fire arrow by mentioning the fact that it was capable of exercising Jogo, implying anything capable of doing that would cook everyone present, but Jogo's maximum meteor also could have achieved some real damage on 15-finger Sukuna, a feat that from a narrative standpoint is pretty damn impressive. We'll circle back to how important this is in a bit, but for the time being, just keep that in mind. For the other disasters, a pretty comfortable low end is the city block to multi-city block ranges. This just comes from calculations of Mahito shaking Shibuya with his curse technique application, and this is something he pulls off so casually in such a weakened state. I'm pretty fine with arguing that all of the other disaster curses should scale. Because of their immense cursed energy, you could also argue that in terms of output and destructive capabilities, they punch above their weight class, even relative to the time they left the series. Mahito's instant spirit body of distorted killing, for example, should be significantly more durable and powerful in close quarters than anything that Itadori shows up until his power-up against Sukuna in chapter 214. Even while both severely nerfed and running on fumes, Mahito is so much tougher than Yuji that the only way to take him down would be a Black Flash with 100% of his energy dedicated to it, something he could only pull off due to Todo's brilliance and consistent assistance in this battle. The fact that Mahito in this form could even survive an attack from an exponentially more powerful Yuji would probably push him into those higher tiers resilience-wise as well. Jogo is another case of punching up, and the main reason comes from his max meteor. This move is often shrugged off in scaling conversations because of its speed, and the fact that both Panda and Kusakabe survived the attack after running for their lives, but the issue with both of these points is pretty simple. In the case of speed, Jogo can just pair his maximum technique with his domain to ensure it lands as intended. We see Yorozu do this with the True Sphere, and the only reason Jogo doesn't implement this strategy for himself is likely because he fears losing a clash to Sukuna. In terms of power, not only is Kusakabe strong enough to deflect Kenjaku's maximum technique point blank with a simple domain, but Panda just loses one of his cores outright because of the impact of this technique, which is, in his case, technically a death. So attempting to downscale it based on their survival is pretty silly. In any case, calculations regarding the output of Jogo's technique based on the tremors place him at large town level, outright the most impressive level of calculable strength for the cluster of curses. You can, however, take it a step further when looking into a statement made about this ability in the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook, in which the capacity to completely incinerate a town is attributed to this technique. Why does this matter? Simple. The energy required to turn something to ash versus vaguely destroy or damage it is significantly greater. For example, say Mike Tyson punches you in the chest. After your bones start crunching like a bag of chips, chances are you're gonna be seeing your deity of choice. If I punch you in the chest and every cell in your body turns into dust scattering in the wind, despite us both giving your family something to mourn, my punch would be a lot stronger. The same logic applies here, and when calculated out, Jogo's maximum meteor gets to country levels of attack potency. Definitely something you want to hear if you put your money on the disaster curses. Much like when talking about the demons, I'll save the specifics of each disaster curse's relevant hacks for the actual outcome portion of the video, but the broad strokes of it are pretty simple and kind of commonly well known. As curses, they all have potent regeneration factors, insanely deep wells of cursed energy, specific techniques, and domains that they can expand to entrap their foes and bombard them with lethal can't miss attacks. With both parties being properly assessed and scaled, it's time to get down to business. Let's talk about the outcome of the upper boons versus the disaster curses. In this battle, both sides have access to something that could give them the edge in a fight, and those circumstances will factor into this equation quite heavily. The question lies in which set of advantages matters the most. On the side of the demons, a few things are true. The first, and honestly most important thing, is that they're faster. A lot faster. So much faster, it's hard to even put into words. For all intents and purposes, just imagine the disaster curses are all fighting characters that are closer to Gojo and Sukuna in performance than they are to them. Between you and me, they're realistically faster, but just so you can have a little bit of a visual. Even the low enders like Daki and Gyutaro would be dozens of times faster than them, and this gap only widens further as you go up the chain of command. The second advantage is that every demon here is practically immortal. I know people hate the Nichiren and Sun argument when discussing Crossroads battles, but even if you ignore both of those a bit unfairly, the bare minimum amount of damage required to kill these demons would be a beheading or complete obliteration of the body. Anything short of that, and they're going to be regenerating from it rather quickly. And their innate durability, speed, and insane regen will make completely destroying them pretty tough. The third major advantage is that they have two more combatants in the disaster curses, 3 if you separate Gyutaro and Daki. So the sanctity of a one-on-one is far from guaranteed. This is all to say, the disaster curses have their work cut out for them, but all hope isn't inherently lost. These guys have advantages as well. For starters, they can all probably survive direct contact with upper moons by way of external durability and their own healing factors, extending the amount of time they have to cope with the speed difference. They also have a Jogo, someone who, when using his max output, has one-shot potential not just for one demon, but for the entire group in one go. The difference in output and durability here is just as massive as it was in the speed department, only in this case, in the curse's favor. Likewise, Mahito has one-shot potential through the use of Idle Transfiguration, something that can bypass conventional durability altogether. And the final point worth noting for these curses is one we all know and love, say it with me, domain expansions. The ability when it comes to Jujutsu Kaisen cross-verse battles, and something that gives the universe a shot at a fight here. I'm gonna be honest with you though. Out of the 3 recent Demon Slayer versus Jujutsu Kaisen videos I've made this past month, this is the one that is the most one-sided. The upper moons absolutely abuse the disaster curse spirits in a way that is actually kinda gross. With the exception of Mahito in his true form, none of these guys have the durability to withstand several vaguely town-level opponents just raining down attacks from any angle faster than they can defend themselves. Sure, Jogo, Hanami, Dagon won't get one shot, but getting hit with attacks that are at the peak of your durability over and over and over again, some of which are going to have hacks imbued into them, certainly isn't going to be good for their health. In all honesty, you throw a Kaza at Hanami, Dagon, Jogo, obviously base form, and Mahito, and 3 of them drop dead the moment his combat compass appears on the floor. The only reason there's a survivor is because Mahito specifically won't die unless you run him out of curse energy or attack his soul directly. But that really won't be an issue here because demons have unlimited stamina. You may be wondering, oh, what about the domain? Sure, Dagon and Hanami's won't do too much, but surely Jogo and Mahito can make something work with theirs. And you know what? Yeah, you'd be right. If Mahito or Jogo opened their domains, and if they got their strongest techniques off, anyone in that barrier dies. Jogo's Max Meteor sends them back to their ancestors, and Idle Transfiguration turns them into more cursed creatures than they already are. The problem is that all of what I just said is a big, a massive, a humongous if. Some of these upper moons, like Kokushibo, Akaza, Daki, and Gyutaro, probably just immediately go for a blitz attempt and end the fight. And it's not like any of their opposition can even stop them. Mahito would survive a blitz attempt for obvious reasons, but even in the event he does get enough breathing room to open his domain, he'd have to catch all of the upper moons in his domain at one time if he hopes to win. He's not like Gojo or Sukuna. Multiple expansions in quick succession is not in the cards for him. So anything but a complete reversal spells his eventual defeat. The funny thing is that someone like Gyoko in his strongest form could probably beat Mahito without all of the fanfare of wearing him down if he decided to bring out his fist punch, a punch that, kind of like the name would entail, turns you into a fish if you get hit by it. Although, I will admit, this is just a battle of who brings out their trump card first. Gyoko is kind of an idiot, Mahito typically doesn't open with the domain, so results may vary. In any case, the only feasible win con lies in Mahito turning the tables on all of the upper moons simultaneously and transfiguring them in his domain. A possibility, sure, but with someone shrewd and vigilant like Kokushibo who has access to the see-through world, or Akaza whose battle compass, which reacts instinctively to bloodlust and battle spirit, he might be continuously cut down before the technique even launches. Now, I've been in the game long enough to know how this goes, right? All the Demon Slayer fans are happy, and all the JJK fans, at least the ones who wanted the curses to win, are wondering where I went wrong in my scaling or interpretations, so we'll address some common talking points. One that I get a lot, is that Kanroji's lightning dodging feat is invalid because it's not real lightning. Based on the anime, we can dispute this pretty easily, as it's clear that the lightning is replicating the cloud to ground movement that gives lightning its speed. But even if you disagree with this idea for whatever reason, it really doesn't matter because we have the Daki calc. Being 200 times faster than sound is so far and above what a generous interpretation of the disaster curses can do that a blitz is all but guaranteed no matter how you slice it. Now, the other big thing that I saw a lot in the comments of my last video was about Dagon of all people. It seems that JJK fans have gotten it in their head that Dagon creates a sun when he opens his domain, but like, does he? Sure, it's light inside, but we never see a clear indication that there's an actual star created in the process. You may refer to this panel when trying to back up your point, but there are plenty of examples of Gege just highlighting a particular point on a page or panel with screen tones to direct the viewer's eyes. Nothing about this indicates that there's a difference or that this is an actual celestial body. You may default to mentioning the fact that it's bright inside and Dagon's domain is meant to evoke the idea of a beach-like environment and thus would need a light source, but that's kind of just appealing to reality to make an argument that doesn't warrant that. Most domains are going to have some source of light produced within them because the sorcerer or curse using the barrier wants to be able to see. With such little evidence, to say that Dagon is creating a sun, and a real one at that, isn't conducive to a solid point to stand on. Sorry to all the Dagon fans out there, I'm wishing you guys well, but the notion of an actual sun existing within his domain isn't very substantiated. Now, as I've attempted to make clear on numerous occasions, when taking into account the typical fighting style and character of both parties, the upper moons absolutely mop the floor with the disaster curses. There are some out of character, plug the controller in kind of moves you could make to get JJK the win, like immediately opening with the domain from Mahito in order to catch all of their opponents off guard. But the scenario only takes place in the most contrived and unfair situations that I could possibly dream up. In an average, typical scenario, one that would really closely adhere to reality, the upper moons win 10 out of 10 times. Okay, so there's a lot to break down here. Scaling wise, much like my Zenitsu versus Kashimo video, I don't think there are too many discrepancies or inaccuracies to get all that upset about. The upper moons are significantly faster than disaster curses in pretty much every scenario, and both parties should be relatively similar in strength at the highest levels, with Jogo and maybe Mahito kind of exceeding that cap. Surprisingly, where people had the most contention wasn't with how I portrayed each side, but the fact that I'd argued they'd be able to fight in the first place. JJK fans left comment after comment after comment after comment, really focusing on the fact that the upper moons don't possess cursed energy and therefore have no way to see curses. Demon Slayer fans left a slew of comments focusing on the lack of Nichiren in Jujutsu Kaisen, leading to no real win con outside of the sun, and like, I don't know how to say this, but are y'all crazy? The very premise of this video is one of combat and comparison. I know the upper moons would literally never fight these curses in canon because they're in different stories. The underlying assumption that I thought we all knew when it came to videos like this was, if this fight could actually occur, who would win? And maybe I'm just old-fashioned, but I think seeing and damaging your opponents fits well within the description. I'm not even really saying you're wrong. Upper moons don't have cursed energy, and Jujutsu Kaisen characters don't have Nichiren blades. My thing is like, what's your point? These characters don't exist in the same universe, yet here we are. For the Nichiren point, I can maybe kinda sorta get it because you can get around that through another means of defeating them. It's not entirely an ignorance of the ability for them to fight, but even still, kinda depends. The funniest thing about this though is that some characters on both sides have ways of dealing with the opposition despite lacking in these specific areas. Mahito's idle transfiguration doesn't have to kill any of the demon's physical body in the conventional sense in order to win against them, as he could just transform their soul and pretty much have immortal puppets. And on the opposite end, for all intents and purposes, characters with extra sensory awareness like Kokushibo via the see-through world or Akaza with his battle compass would be able to ascertain the position of their opponents. And despite not being able to kill them conventionally, they have infinite stamina, and these curses, who are literally composed of the energy they expend for combat, don't. You also have characters like Gyoko and Nakime, who don't even really need to damage the curses to win against them. I mentioned Gyoko's fish punch before in the video, but Nakime can really just strum their guitar, send everyone in a certain radius to the Infinity Castle, and remove all of their allies at their leisure, leaving the curses stranded on a forever expanding fortress. So, I say that all to say, I like to assume each side of the fence can interact with each other in the full manner that they would if they shared universes to get to the heart of the question. Outside of specific anomalies like throwing Asta in a cross-verse battle, I'm likely going to assume each power system is accounted for. And as a quick note for JJK fans, y'all really don't want to strip someone of cursed energy anyway when they're fighting someone outside of Sukuna. It all but guarantees their domains would be ineffective, which and this fight is essential to giving them a fighting chance in the first place. Despite all of this though, the Upper Moons do win against the Disaster Curses, who are largely victims of their role in the story, kneecapping the limits of their highball speed scaling and even the upper limits of their basic attack potency. But I've kept you waiting long enough. The next video is going to be the rematch of Yuji versus Tanjiro to see who's really stronger when we take Yuji by Jujutsu Kaisen's end and throw him back up against Tanjiro Kamado. Tanjiro Kamado and Yuji Itadori, two kind-hearted protagonists from extremely popular battle shonen, and two characters who reach some of the greatest heights of power that their universe has to offer. And in this video, I'll be pitting them against one another. Over 2 years ago, I compared these two on the basis of their strength, speed, and abilities, but over that time, Yuji gained a sizable amount of feats and techniques, and a version of Tanjiro still sealed behind the chapters of the Demon Slayer manga wasn't discussed. So you can consider this a rematch, the runback of Yuji Itadori versus Tanjiro Kamado. Much like scaling any high-tier Demon Slayer character, when it comes to assessing Tanjiro's overall power, there are a few key points in the story to make note of and reference. In regards to attack potency, we see that at his peak, he's able to pretty consistently fight against and deal with Upper Moon level combatants like Akaza, as even before mastering the sun-breathing style, he's able to dole out damage to the demon and directly block attacks from him. Even on the lower end interpretation of this scaling, Tanjiro's output and durability would be well into the city block levels. The calculation that derives this figure is based on an impact created in Rengoku and Akaza's fight, and considering the fact that he continues to progress in strength as time goes on, and Tanjiro at this point in the story has likely surpassed Rengoku in both sword and breathing mastery, we can safely use this as a floor for his power. On the higher end, you can place Tanjiro all the way at town level based on Gyuto's destruction of the Red Light District, and you can tie Tanjiro to this feat in a myriad of ways. The first of which is just by arguing that with his mark in play, Tanjiro is powerful enough to sever Gyuto's head from his body, deflect and counter his blood demon arts, and for a time, match Upper Moon 6 in terms of combat ability, so being somewhat relative to this final blast makes sense. Even if for some reason you don't believe that Tanjiro in this moment scales relatively, he grows numerous times stronger than this over the course of the story, and continues to fight against demons that rank higher than Gyutaro could. The second way to support this claim is using the Upper Moon scaling method. Due to each moon's number correlating to the concentration and volume of Muzan's blood in their body, Tanjiro facing off against Upper 4 and later Upper 3 gives him direct scaling above Gyutaro in base physicals, even when you don't take the Muzan fight into account. This town level scaling should apply mainly to his sword strikes rather than his innate physical durability. Reason being that while he's capable of surviving glancing blows from Akaza or knock them off course with his own strength, it's obvious that if Tanjiro took any of those attacks head on, he'd instantly die, or at least be injured beyond his ability to fight back. This is pretty consistent not only with Tanjiro's own internal statements, but also with how human versus demon fights are shown in the series, as Rengoku, when placed in a similar situation, was able to combat and ward off Akaza's advances, but was pretty much instantly skewered when a serious blow landed squarely. Chances are, Tanjiro's physical durability is a notch or two below what he's able to exert through the strength of his arms and breathing techniques. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're entirely incomparable, but the difference should be noted. Speed-wise, things get a bit more contentious, so I'll lay out a few different feats in calc so we can cross-reference to get a consistent ballpark for Tanjiro's combat speed. In the Red Light District arc, we have two pretty solid feats that establish these characters can be hundreds to potentially thousands of times faster than sound. The first is based on Daki reacting to and blocking the bombs launched by Tengen in order to protect Gyutaro, and the second comes from Tengen Uzui cutting his own bombs before they're able to explode. The anime does a really good job of showing us that Daki isn't moving until after the explosion has already started occurring, but is still able to put her obi sashes around them to defuse the blast. When calculated, this places her speed at well over 200 times faster than sound, which scales back to Tanjiro even within that arc, as shown when his rage boost allows him to blitz her and her sashes. As far as I'm concerned, this is the floor of Demon Slayer high tiers. While other feats and situations may have some level of ambiguity or wiggle room, This moment is really clear-cut and unambiguous. Some may try to argue that Muzan getting caught in the explosion in Ubuyashiki's manor invalidates this showing, but Muzan himself makes it quite obvious that he wasn't expecting a trap on the scale and was thus caught off guard. He's also not really at risk of dying from the explosion itself and tends to look down on the capabilities of every human not named Yoriichi, which further adds to the idea that he's not acting at a level reflective of his full combat prowess. The second explosion-related feat in the District arc is even more impressive and comes in the way of Tengen slicing through his bombs, accomplishing this before they detonate, and when Kalp has his combat or slashing speed approaching that of Mach 1800. It's a showing that may seem far-fetched on the face of it, but just think about the ridiculous kinds of speed necessary to cut through a tiny explosive ball, and then cut through 2 others before the first one detonates. Once again, from a calculation perspective, it's pretty concrete, but I do understand that the narrative or idea surrounding Demon Slayer does somewhat contrast this, at least in many people's minds. In the comment section of the last few Demon Slayer videos that I made, the idea of these characters being regular humans came up, and while I maybe understand that from a basic level, as, you know, their breathing effects aren't real, I really don't know what to say to that except reread the manga or watch the anime. Even with fake breathing effects, the feats of strength being accomplished are very much real and achieved through total concentration breathing, a supernatural style of breathing that does give them supernatural abilities. Otherwise, you wouldn't have people moving so fast it sounds thunderous, blocking attacks capable of blowing up buildings, and all of the other superhuman showings all throughout the Demon Slayer manga. These characters, while maybe more grounded than, say, Goku, aren't exactly normal humans. In any case, while these levels of speed are extremely impressive, there is one greater, if not more contentious, calculable feat in Kanroji's dodging of lightning. Probably the most hotly debated idea when it comes to cross versus Demon Slayer scaling, at least in my experience, but something that I do think is worth at least briefly mentioning. Kanroji is able to avoid multiple direct attacks from lightning bolts even before attaining a Slayer mark, and considering the fact that she's said to be faster than Uzui, at least in terms of her slicing speed, it's actually not far-fetched to say she'd scale to the Mach 2000 figure listed in the calculation of this avoidance feat. Many argue that due to the lightning being summoned by the byproduct of a blood demon art, it shouldn't have the same level of speed as naturally occurring lightning. And while I think that this is narratively going against what the point of this encounter is, you are able to fall back on the other feats listed if you're skeptical, all of which Tanjiro would not only scale to, but above due to his consistent growth in power from the Yashiro training, battle lamps, and Slayer marks. Now, I have to reiterate, because I know a lot of people don't like to listen, even if you disregard Kanroji's lightning dodging statement, we still have 2 other feats that place Tanjiro anywhere from 200 to 1800 times faster than sound. Now, you may wonder why up to this point I haven't mentioned any of Tanjiro's Muzan feats. Muzan is obviously much stronger than Akaza or any of his upper moons, and Tanjiro was able to fight him solo for several minutes, demonstrating some obvious level of relativity, so why not choose to include that? The main reason is that I don't think he scales to any version of Muzan that's super quantifiable. Very similar to Yuji and Sukuna's situation, while extenuating circumstances allowed for the protagonist to take on the primary antagonist in a 1v1 for a time, it's only possible because of how significant of a loss in power that the villain experienced. The Muzan that was fighting against, and still stronger than Tanjiro in that moment, was one in the process of aging thousands of years and constantly being worn down. Anytime before that, and Tanjiro shows pretty obviously that he isn't on that level. I would agree that mastery of sun breathing, something he only achieves in his battle with Muzan, gives him an increase to technique, speed, and power. We just can't quantify how great that gap is to the same degree we can using other Hashira and upper moons as reference. In terms of unique abilities, fighting skill, and hacks, Tanjiro isn't exactly a Swiss Army knife of abilities, but he does have a decent repertoire that he can fall back on. His most commonly relied on techniques are his water and sun breathing, fueled by the strength and skill granted from total concentration. By the story's end, this provides him with a pretty flexible offensive and defensive kit that pairs well with his extrasensory and somewhat precognitive abilities. The opening thread and see-through world are the abilities in question, and these allow Tanjiro to predict an opponent's movements by looking directly at the flow of one's power, muscle movements, and even blood flow to assess their next step. and in the most extreme cases, he's able to even compensate for impaired vision with this sense of smell. Entering the see-through world itself is implied to be an amp on combat proficiency that allows Tanjiro to close the gap against Akaza and his battle compass, and is pretty consistently depicted like this in other Hashira versus Upper Moon battles. His Slayer mark allows for a very basic and straightforward stat amp that is caused by increasing his body heat and heart rate, and while Tanjiro says that he intends to increase his strength by 100 times when it's first revealed, it's likely not that powerful, as it hasn't historically allowed a Hashira somewhat relative to a demon to merely toy with them after the fact. Rather, it tends to be an equalizing force that likely doubles to quadruples the user's strength. Alongside some minor soul hex resistance, this is pretty much all of what can be expected to be useful in his kit against Yuji, and we'll talk about Tanjiro's other form a bit later in the video when the outcome is being discussed. Very similarly to Tanjiro, by the story's end, while Yuji isn't the strongest character in the verse, he's certainly much closer to holding that top spot than he was at earlier points in the story, including when I talked about his abilities a couple years ago. In many ways, my stance on Jujutsu Kaisen high tier scaling has become a bit more measured than it was in the past, and if you watch the first iteration of this matchup and compare it to how I scale him here, I think you'll understand what I mean. With the exception of outliers of physical force like Sukuna, Gojo, and maybe Mythic Beast Amber Kashimo, Itadori should be above or comparable to just about any character we've seen in the story on the basis of physical stats. You don't have to think that he beats any heavy hitter in a protracted fight, but it's undebatable that he does scale within that tier pretty consistently. Not only is he able to keep up with Yuta and Rika when fighting within the domain, but he gets significantly more powerful after his awakening and little 1v1 with Sukuna. There's no calculable increase, sure, but the climb was so aggressive that Sukuna himself wondered if Yuji was going to ascend to his level by way of chaining together black flashes and constantly awakening, which definitely means he was making some serious headway. Now, whether or not Sukuna means his full health power or weakened state strength when referring to reaching him is hard to tell, but it's still a sentiment that allows us to understand that Yuji is a beast in the physical department, making every other high tier feat pretty applicable to himself. This means low end stuff on the strength and durability scale, like Curse Nalia blasting through a city and destroying a ton of it in the process links back to him. A weaker version of Maki than the one that Yuji should scale to is able to tank it without a single scratch, and when calculated out, this gives us a solid multi-city block level baseline of power, and is especially good for a durability scale. Kicking it up a level, Yuji's strikes and resilience should scale in those small town to town level ranges based on Ishigori's Granite Blast feats, and Akotsu's ability to survive or outright tank that blast on several occasions. While it is true that Ishigori's peak durability remains greater than Yuta and Yuji's even after training for Shinjuku, it's made quite clear in Sendai that Yuta can deal damage to him with punches, and can mostly maintain his body structure even after getting hit by Ishigori's Granite Blast at range or up close. His physical power likely increases throughout Shinjuku due to his awakening, but once again, it's impossible to determine just by how much. Vaguely, town levels of strength are pretty consistent within this tier, as Arame on multiple occasions creates ice structures that are calced to be on that level, and based on the relativity in combat to Hikari, there's no real reason to assume they'd be significantly above Yuji in output. When it comes to speed, Jujutsu Kaisen high tiers can have a pretty wide range, and as does tend to be the case with the series, where you place Yuji will come down to a lot of interpretation and how much grace you're willing to give certain statements. Reasonably, I think that Yuji should scale anywhere from a dozen or so times faster than sound to lightning timer ranges, depending on how you look at things. Nayu's accursed speed statements aside, hypersonic JJK is relatively consistent at the highest levels. Shibuya Yuji is able to dodge piercing blood at point blank range, gunfire in the Jujutsu Kaisen universe is consistently made light of even in close quarters, and characters like Kenjaku make light of piercing blood speed on multiple occasions. All of these feats and instances in some way, shape, or form should be relevant to Itadori's speed scaling. It may sound a little far-fetched to place Yuji and Kenjaku on even footing as I have, but remember, I'm only commenting on speed. Whether or not Kenjaku would beat Yuji overall is much less important than if they scale somewhat relatively in this instance. Both Yuta and Maki are implied to be capable enough to face Kenjaku and not absolutely embarrass themselves, which would require some relative stat scaling to achieve. And I already discussed how Yuji should be comparable to them. With this line of logic, Yuji would probably be 10 or so times faster than sound when taking increases in stats and other tidbits into account. The lightning timer scaling is something I'm sure you're familiar with if you've seen my JJK scaling on the channel before, so say it with me now. It all comes from Hikari's lightning avoidance feat. If you believe that in either instance of Kashimo's lightning being visually registered or mentally reacted to, that Hikari is capable of doing this and therefore scales, then Yuji alongside all of the other characters relative to or greater in strength than Hikari would be at this level as well. If you couldn't tell from my voice, I view this as a slightly contentious feat to use, largely because Hikari doesn't actually physically do anything in response to either attack. It's obvious that he can make mental adjustments and react to this level of speed, but he never outright avoids the attack in a way that's pretty objective or obvious, but I digress. Taking this feat in the most generous way would put Yuji on that lightning timer tier. Just like with Tanjiro, I don't see much point in using Sukuna scaling and applying it back to Yuji. Not only does Sukuna in character toy around with his opponents typically and actually fluctuate in strength based on interest, but he's significantly weaker than what his full power allows for at pretty much every point Yuji shows he can trade blows with him. This just leaves us to discuss Yuji's hacks, something that I didn't really have to do that much in the first rendition of this matchup, but now has a bit more meat on the bones. In preparation for their fight with Sukuna, Yuji picked up on several high-level techniques in the world of sorcery, including Simple Domain and Reverse Curse technique, the latter of which has increased proficiency due to blood manipulation, making the control of his body that much simpler. We see that he's skilled enough to recover from fatal wounds regularly and recover limbs in a matter of moments. As I said, alongside these learned techniques, Itadori also developed innate techniques in the way of blood manipulation and shrine. It's unknown how deep Yuji's blood manipulation bag goes by the end of the story, just because he doesn't use that technique solo very frequently in the battle against Sukuna. He's able to launch piercing blood, but only with the help of his brother, and we're never shown that he could use techniques like Supernova or Flowing Red Scale, two techniques that could have certainly aided him in his fight to the death with Sukuna. What Yuji does seem to gain a good handle on is Shrine, which he obtains after awakening through a chain of black flashes. Dismantle and cleave in their base state is something that he has access to, which means physical slashes that are invisible to most characters and probably slightly scale above his own physical durability and attack potency are in his toolkit. His soul awareness allows him to take it up a level though, accurately targeting the boundaries between the soul and body and severing them as he so chooses, an extension of his ability to disrupt that boundary with physical attacks. Yuji is the only character in the story to reliably and consistently land black flashes as well, a phenomenon that is said to result in an exponential increase in power and curse energy output for a mere instant. He can't exactly use it at will, but he sure can get pretty close. Finally, we have the trump card of basically every high tier worth their salt, the domain expansion. In Yuji's case, its showings are rather constrained. Based on its limited use cases against Sukuna, it probably just has the same shrine hit effect imbued within it, only with the added benefit of being able to target the soul. All that being said, both characters have now been scaled and evaluated, so it's time to discuss who would win. The rematch between Yuji and Tanjiro is pitched in some ways and very lopsided in others. On the matter of strength and durability, Yuji and Tanjiro should be pretty evenly matched, existing within the same town level tier of each other and being able to combat characters that outstrip them in that regard just a bit. You could argue that Tanjiro's sword strikes would be a tad more lethal than Yuji's base attacks, but this can mostly be countered with Dismantle and Cleave, as well as the fact that Yuji's durability should be much more congruent with his physical output. As mentioned earlier, Tanjiro can get one-shot by attacks that he can otherwise deflect with his sword if he takes them head on, and Yuji isn't shown to have this same problem. This isn't to say that Tanjiro is one-shotting Yuji so long as he gets a slash off, or that Yuji is one-shotting Tanjiro with one basic punch, but I will say that in a stand-up, no dodging showdown, my money is on Yuji to come out on top. His ability to stop himself from dying from blood loss, as well as reverse curse technique, would also factor into his ability to win a brawl like this. Hacks-wise, I'd also say that Yuji has an advantage, even more sizable than the one that stems from their physicality. I already mentioned his healing factor, but he can also send slashes that, unless Tanjiro is using See-Through World, should be completely invisible to him. This alone gives him a major increase of potential attacking options, as we see him use the technique to alter the environment and press Sukuna further even when just gaining access to the technique. If he's pushed to his limit, the possibility of landing a black flash is also extremely likely, and might even lead to an increase of potency great enough to finish the fight outright upon landing. This is ignoring Itadori's greatest known ability, his domain expansion, which would all but guarantee that Tanjiro is bombarded with attacks that can harm him severely and pretty quickly incapacitate him. In contrast, the precognitive abilities of the See-Through World, opening thread, and power increase of the Slayer mark somewhat pales in comparison. With two advantages going towards Yuji, you might want to count Tanjiro out, but despite technically having fewer stats above Itadori, he makes up for it by creating a massive gap in the speed department. If you've watched my other Demon Slayer videos, you know that the difference in speed between Demon Slayer characters and sorcerers in Jujutsu Kaisen is often staggering. Even somewhat low-end interpretations of Tanjiro's scaling place him at a level far beyond anything that Yuji could reasonably or unreasonably scale to. Uzui's bomb-slashing feat alone is more impressive than where you could put Yuji at, even if you say he's vaguely a lightning timer based on the dubious Akari feat. Pair this gap with Tanjiro's ability to read his opponent's movements based on their internals, and you have an extremely lopsided division of combat ability overall. Yuji's conventional physical attacks would be rendered inert on the basis of Tanjiro simply being overwhelmingly faster. But unsurprisingly, despite this disadvantage, Itadori does have some win cons. Now, these conditions rely on you assuming that Tanjiro doesn't aim to immediately decapitate Yuji, as this isn't something he'd be able to react to or heal from, but against humans, I don't think you necessarily have to assume Tanjiro would apply the same attack strategy that he does against demons. Anything from a limb being removed to a deep piercing attack could be healed by Yuji and potentially countered with invisible slashes of his own. Tanjiro does have to intentionally focus to enter the see-through world, so if Shrine is used before that happens, it's possible that Tanjiro was handicapped in the moments following his initial strike. This scenario doesn't happen often though, if I can be completely honest with you, but it is a feasible way for Yuji to respond and weaken his opponent before he is killed. And a similar logic applies for Yuji opening his domain in response to getting blitzed, but not finished. The reason I find it to be unlikely is multifaceted, but the common through line is that it relies on many conveniences and generous readings of how this fight would play out in Yuji's favor. The first fact is that you have to assume Tanjiro does an inadequate job of striking Yuji down in one go. I've already established that he can kill Yuji with his slashes, especially if cursed energy isn't being shored up in preparation to take an attack. So Tanjiro going for a less effective and surefire way to kill him, specifically when he's been trained to go for nothing but decapitations, is not exactly what I would consider the baseline assumption. The second factor is that you have to somewhat plug the controller into Yuji to make him behave in the way needed for him to win. Despite the development of his techniques, Yuji has shown himself to be a brawler first and foremost, choosing to get up close and personal with Sukuna despite the obvious disadvantages it comes with. We also never really see him use slashes at a distance in the Shinjuku showdown. He only seems to use the cleave function of Shrine. Now, he obviously should have it, but having him use it in this manner, especially so soon when it's just not within his character consistently, is giving him another pretty massive benefit. And a similar truth exists for his domain. Granted, in this instance, we don't have a large enough sample size of showings to say that he'd never open a fight like that, but in turn, it's difficult to say that he would. And the final point here is that you have to assume the see-through world isn't in play yet. If Tanjiro is able to perceive the slashes, he probably just avoids them. Like I said, Yuji does have win conditions, but I wouldn't say that he has enough at a consistent enough level to argue that he just beats Tanjiro here more than he doesn't. Something that only becomes more true if you bring the Demon King Tanjiro version into the equation. A stronger, faster, more vicious version of the character just shuts out any chance of Yuji's victory here. Base to base, I'd say that Yuji ekes out a win anywhere from 2 to maybe 4 times out of 10, a number that unfortunately shrinks to 0 if Tanjiro fights in his demon form. The second round of discussion between Yuji and Tanjiro, as expected, was pretty controversial, but before I dive into some of the larger arguments I saw, I did want to address a pretty frequent comment and give a correction. In the video, I said that Yuji can't use Supernova, and it was brought to my attention that Yuji detonated the blood that he had spit in Sukuna's face within Akotsu's domain. This is pretty much the exact way that Supernova is described, as it's a detonation of condensed blood that Choso uses on Yuji, Naoya, and later Kenjaku. This is, simply put, a true blue incorrect piece of information on my part, born from the lack of similar application and presentation. While I do and did remember Yuji demonstrating the capacity to detonate his blood while making this video, because it wasn't used in the same fashion as any of Choso's prior attacks, nor had the technique's name as part of the panel, I didn't even really qualify them as the same thing in my mind. What I should have said to get my point across is that Yuji doesn't seem to have the same mindset to set up externally converting sphere bloods outside of his body to detonate, despite using a variation of the technique in battle. So that's just my fault. I don't think it has too much impact on the outcome, but a correction is a correction. Aside from this, I think there are a few pretty big contentions made with this video and outcome that I want to address. Firstly, being the sword durability argument. Interestingly enough, it was a pretty common talking point to bring up the idea of Tanjiro's sword either breaking just by coming into contact with Yuji, or it very easily being broken throughout the duration of the fight. And while I understand the logic used to come to this conclusion, it falls apart pretty quickly if you just think about it a little bit. Most people say that in order for weapons in the Jujutsu Kaisen universe to deal damage to sorcerers, it needs to be amped beyond its normal capacity and given greater resilience, which sure is true for normal weapons in the Jujutsu Kaisen universe, but this excludes the existence of cursed tools that like Maki or Toji could wield. But even aside from that, it's obvious that in the world of Demon Slayer, Nichiren and the amazing feats of blacksmithing performed in the universe just surpass those natural limits. It's how you have Tanjiro blocking attacks that are splitting clouds and towns, and it's what allows him to keep striking at the necks of demons comparable to Itadori in durability without it so much as chipping. Could Yuji, in theory, break the blade by attacking it from the side Akaza style or using cleave? Probably, yeah, but as mentioned in the video, he's too slow to really do anything about Tanjiro's speed except open his domain. This would net him the victory, as I said in the original video, but that's just not how Yuji typically fights given the information we've seen. I honestly think he'd attempt to rely on his physical abilities first and have that preference taken advantage of by Tanjiro's superior speed and comparable strength. In short, the fictional metal that holds up to town level attacks probably won't break just by coming into contact with Yuji's sheer aura, despite how massive it may be. The second main point of contention, or at least one I found the most useful to discuss, was the idea of the see-through world interacting with Yuji's invisible slashes. A few people in the comments doubted the validity of this interpretation, so I thought I'd expand a bit on why I thought it would work. The main reason that I think someone like Tanjiro would be capable of noticing Yuji's slashes are due to the similarities in depiction between Maki's and Tanjiro's extrasensory perception, and even Tanjiro's superiority in that department. Both Tanjiro and Maki, after discovering this new sensory dimension, are immediately described to have changed to an almost unreasonable extent by outside observers, and in the midst of combat, the amp given just due to a change in senses allows them to essentially blitz characters that just moments before were greatly above them in speed. While Maki's growth seems to stem from her ability to notice the subtle changes in the atmosphere, Tanjiro's growth quite literally comes from being able to see what is not normally seen, the typical transparency of things given visible form that Tanjiro can now interface with. If for no other reason than Tanjiro's clarity of sight and similarities to the awakening responsible for Maki's perception of Sukuna's slashes, I think the see-through world grants Tanjiro a very clear counter to those invisible attacks. As I said in the video, if you disagree with this notion, he probably just loses more often than not because of how versatile and useful these attacks can be in a fight. I simply think the combination of enhanced smell and sight leads Tanjiro to victory. In any case, a correction aside, I don't think there's much I'd change about this video in terms of a verdict, much to the chagrin of Yuji fans. In my mind, he pulls off a win 30 to 40% of the time, but is overall not poised to win as often as Tanjiro. Maybe this will change due to some statements or feats in Modulo, but for the time being, this is how I see the fight playing out. In any case, now that our protagonists have come out and shown their stuff, it's time to see how the main antagonists of Jujutsu Kaisen and Demon Slayer fare. A showdown of kings in the form of Sukuna versus Muzan. Sukuna versus Muzan. The most powerful Jujutsu sorcerer in history versus the king of all demons. These two characters naturally garner comparisons due to their similar roles and level of power within their respective stories. And the battles between these villains and their protagonists was, and still is, the hardest fight their main cast had to deal with. And in this video, we'll be deciding who's stronger, the King of Curses or the Demon King. As what is essentially the pinnacle of the Demon Slayer universe, Muzan Kibutsuchi scales to nearly every feat in the entire Demon Slayer manga. The Hashira, lower, and upper moon demons that he commands all scale far below him individually, and this is important when going over his specific stats. Starting with attack potency, Demon Slayer characters are kinda wonky, or rather unimpressive relative to some of Muzan's other abilities that he has at his disposal. In a weakened state during the final battle of of the manga, his tendrils and extra limbs are capable of smashing up buildings very casually and creating craters in the ground that are calculated to be about building level in terms of scope. Muzan himself doesn't really demonstrate very many destructive feats aside from a few that we'll be talking about, as for a majority of the manga, he's a non-combatant and delegates his fighting to his underlings. This delegation, however, allows us to scale him off of his lower level demons, namely Doma, who, with the creation of his Ice Buddha, is calculated to have city block levels of output, which is a pretty healthy upgrade from the building level feats that Muzan puts on display in his fight. We can take his attack potency and general strength one step further when we notice that the impact and shockwaves of Muzan's attacks are able to reach much further than the direct area that he's attacking, and when accounting for the distance covered, intensity of the shockwaves, and speed at which they travel, Muzan's attack potency can be scaled all the way to large town level, which is pretty alright all things considered. As is the case with most characters that use their own body to fight, Muzan's durability should be somewhat comparable to his own attack potency, which is why he can withstand the force of his own attacks. This applies for most of his body, however his neck specifically should be much tougher than any other part of him, as this seems to be where demons generally concentrate most of their durability. By the way, I just want to nip this potential argument in the bud, but just because the Infinity Castle was constructed from the blood demon art of one of his underlings does not in fact mean that the character doing so has infinite attack potency and that Muzan would possess that as well. If we were to use that logic, then Sukuna being able to clash domains with Gojo, someone whose domain possesses and fills the user's brain with an infinite amount of information, would also put him in that tier. Needless to say, it's not only inconsistent with other feats demonstrated in the story, but the ability itself is never implied to be reflective of the demon's overall outputting abilities. Now, while Muzan's power is certainly of note, especially when you go into the higher end arguments for him, I would argue that his speed, and Demon Slayer characters' speed in general, is much more impressive relative to their overall scaling than anything. I say this mainly because even lower tier Hashira that Muzan would absolutely trounce have feats under their belt that's definitely enough to turn heads and at least be somewhat interesting. Kanroji is a great example of this, as before taking on the Hashira training, she was capable of rather consistently dodging, reacting to, and even slashing bolts of lightning, and Muzan is capable of blitzing her and several other characters consistently shown to be much faster than her, even after multiple training arcs and buffs that would consistently amplify her previously shown speed. Even if we're not able to get an exact figure from knowing all of this information, it does just mean that Muzan's speed is his second biggest upside when going into a fight with someone like Sukuna. Now, the consistency of Kanroji's lightning dodging and the lack of contradicting statements or feats makes this quite the reasonable place to scale the character and anybody that scales above her, but I have seen extreme low balls and high balls for where this character and high tiers in general could scale in the speed department, so I'll cover them quickly. People highballing Muzan in particular would argue that he and his upper moons should be sub-relativistic in speed, or simply put, approaching the speed of light in terms of their combat and attack speed due to the sheer difference between them and every other lightning timer level character. While this in itself isn't necessarily absurd, I do think that it is a much greater interpretation of Muzan's speed than what is intended in many instances of the Demon Slayer manga. Conversely, I also find the vaguely faster than sound arguments for Demon Slayer characters silly, and it is mostly predicated on very early Zenitsu scaling and a general skepticism for a verse like Demon Slayer being fast. As always, I'll account for these discrepancies in speed scaling when going over the match and its outcome, but if you're looking for my personal interpretation of Muzan's speed, just know that he's greatly beyond being a lightning timer. This just leaves us to discuss Muzan's hacks and abilities, and if his speed was his second greatest advantage, then his myriad of hacks and techniques are a clear first. In terms of normal resistances, Muzan has plenty. Any attack that isn't reinforced by Nichiren isn't capable of killing him. His natural regeneration is absolutely ridiculous and surpasses all of the healing factors shown in the series up to this point. All of his on-screen healing feats are even more impressive when you consider the fact that at this point, he's poisoned and aging at an extremely rapid rate, forcing his healing factor to kick into overdrive. Alongside this, he also has the standard never-ending stamina of a demon, as well as being impervious to death without the aid of the sun. In his combat form, Muzan gains an extra set of limbs and general general combat abilities, not too dissimilar from the King of Curses who he'll be going up against. In this combat form, he has whip-like appendages that he can extend from his arms, legs, and spine at high speeds to attack from a distance, and suctions that can draw any opponent within range unwillingly. To the chagrin of the Hashira and fans of Demon Slayer in that final fight, these whips seem to be a primary form of attack for Muzan, and they're quite effective. Muzan is also able to infuse his own blood into his attacks, which makes repeated contact with him and his slashes a continuously deadly occurrence as his blood causes cell death. His blood can also be utilized to create solid spikes, and with his blood demon art, he can even shoot out massive blasts of energy that damage the nervous system of anyone caught within its blast radius. Muzan's abilities and resistances are the main contributors to what makes this such an interesting fight when regarding his clash with Sukuna, and makes this more than a potential one-sided slaughter in any given character's favor. So far, we've analyzed his speed, we've analyzed his power, and now we've analyzed his abilities. Before I can go over the outcome of this fight, however, we must first do the same for Ryomen Sukuna. Much like Muzan, Sukuna exists as a nearly uncontested pillar of individual power within his universe, and as such, scaling his physical abilities is relatively simple. When it comes to his strength and general attack potency, this fact is extremely obvious. Even with only 15 fingers worth of his power, Sukuna at the bare minimum should be able to output city levels of force with his high level attacks, as demonstrated in Shibuya with his domain expansion and fire arrow combination used on Maharaga. Obviously, not being at full power here would necessitate that a full 20-finger Sukuna would be capable of exerting even larger amounts of force at any given moment. But when trying to determine how much more, you need look no further than the domain expansions of disaster class level cursed spirits like Jogo and Dagon to find your answer. Why these two? Well, the answer lies in the creation of their domains and the contents of it. The mountain and island respectively created within these cursed spirits domain is merely a manifestation of their own innate domains brought into reality via cursed energy, and the creation of such large masses of land is in itself indicative of quite the energy output potency, especially when considering that these characters are capable of creating such swaths of land in an instant. Sukuna greatly eclipses both characters in refinement, output, efficiency, and reserves, as Jogo acknowledges that he'd get absolutely demolished if he clashed domains with Sukuna, which states pretty directly that the potency of Sukuna's domain is greater than that of Jogo's and Dagon's as a result of the power rankings amongst disaster cursed spirits. Now, you may doubt the validity of this line of scaling because the external barriers of domains are always so small, but that supposed contradiction is explained within the story itself. The nature of barrier techniques allow for a warping of space in such a way that the internal and external conditions are not congruent with one another, which is why in Gojo and Sukuna's fight, the outside of the domain is smaller than that of a basketball, yet Gojo and Sukuna have no trouble duking it out inside the barrier. The same thing rings true here, and the creation of massive land masses with Jogo and Dagon. This domain scaling indicates that these characters are capable of constructing huge chunks of land with their cursed energy alone. And while this wouldn't normally translate to a JJK character's base durability or stats, in Gojo and Sukuna's case, it more than likely does, or at least have some correlation, as Gojo is capable of tanking Jogo's domain-based attacks with no trouble, yet Sukuna is capable of harming Satoru on multiple occasions in their fight. What substantiates this even more are two calcs that estimate Gojo is around island level, based on him being able to power a country with his cursed energy alone, and an earthquake caused by his unsealing being scaled and properly analyzed. Considering how relative these two characters are in basically every combat capacity, saying that Sukuna scales comparatively to Gojo based on these calcs isn't at all absurd or unreasonable. Substantiating further the mountain to island levels of strength, Sukuna should be capable of wielding that much more. This should also apply to his durability, considering that the same cursed energy used to enhance his physical abilities can conversely be used to reinforce his body and make him significantly more sturdy. Sturdy enough to even survive a 200% hollow purple with only the loss of his arms, and a secondary purple towards the tail end of his fight with Gojo while still surviving. In terms of speed, it gets a little bit more complicated as there are many more levels that you can scale Sukuna to and many more interpretations that you can have for the character, with the lowest of low ends placing him vaguely above Mach 3, which is based on the Naoya projection sorcery statement and Maki's ability to outspeed that. Sukuna obviously has shown himself in his gauntlet to be able to go back and forth with Maki, so it's quite clear that he should at the bare minimum scale to whatever Maki was able to. You can greatly raise the ceiling for what Sukuna scaling can be by looking at his blitz of piercing blood. Moving so fast relative to an attack that moves faster than sound would put him anywhere from 25 to 50 times the speed of sound himself. This range is what I would consider most consistent and defendable for Jujutsu Kaisen speed scaling, but you can argue that other characters in the story, namely Akari, has been shown capable of dodging and reacting to lightning, as is demonstrated in his fight against Kashimo, and his implied relativity to other heavy hitters would place Sukuna well beyond that. In a vacuum, this lightning timer scaling doesn't really follow any poor line of reasoning, with it mostly falling apart or at least being placed under a very critical lens due to the angle and nature of Akari's supposed avoidance. Whether Akari was capable of outright dodging that stroke of lightning or Kashimo merely aimed for that place on his body is difficult to determine, and while Akari was able to eject curse energy from his body and perceive a stroke of lightning from Kashimo later in their bout, it's impossible to extrapolate how this correlates necessarily to his physical combat speed. I'll still leave this as a potential high end for Sukuna, but it's not necessarily what I would consider bulletproof in terms of reasoning. Finally, you have light speed Jujutsu Kaisen scaling, which would only apply to Gojo and Sukuna, and in all honesty, this level of interpretation for the verse doesn't have any legs to stand on. Sure, Sukuna is shown avoiding an attack that should be moving at light speed, as Kashimo is shooting off electromagnetic waves, but once again, the ambiguous nature of the feat doesn't allow for a concrete determination of Sukuna's speed. Did he dodge once the attack had already been launched, or was he in the process of avoiding where Kashimo was aiming? Both are very realistic possibilities with no way to prove one way or the other, and as such, I find it to be quite shaky as a point. Could you argue it? Sure, but it's pretty narratively consistent with all of the other characters and their speed shown throughout the manga, so I'll cap Sukuna's speed scaling at being vaguely above a lightning timer, with everything above that just being unfounded or a bit too vague to argue logical consistency for fights within Jujutsu Kaisen thus far. Now, while Sukuna's strength, speed, and durability would already make him one of the strongest characters in his verse, very similarly to Muzan, I think that it's his unique arsenal of moves, and in Sukuna's case specifically, his strategic mindset, that take him from being your average tough fight to the most grueling opponent our protagonists have faced in the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen. Dismantle and Cleave obviously exists as the core of Sukuna's kit, and a moveset that on its own trips up many characters in the story. The sheer cutting power of this technique, combined with their invisible nature, allows for Sukuna to cut down a majority of his universe without worry, and when Cleave's durability adjusting slashes are involved, the lethality of Sukuna's slashing capabilities is only amplified. On top of his normal techniques, he also has reverse curse technique, which allows him to heal from insane amounts of damage, ranging from limb loss to the very destruction of his heart. And in Sukuna's case specifically, he's even capable of reviving himself upon death so long as the damage isn't too extreme. And even fighting without a heart for extended periods of time doesn't seem to be much of an issue for him. Even poison should be no trouble for Sukuna to heal from, as he has a top 3 reverse curse technique display in the entire story. Now, whether or not he's straight up immune to toxic or poisonous attacks is a bit ambiguous, as it's implied that Yuji's immunity to poisons is in some way linked to Sukuna, but it's hard to determine whether it's caused by him or not. As the king of toxins, Sukuna could be immune to them himself, or this title could simply be referring to him being the greatest poison in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. In the event Sukuna himself bears no immunity, reverse curse technique is still an option that he has at his disposal. Now, alongside his regenerative ability and slashing techniques, his maneuverability is greatly amplified by his capacity to jump off air, just like Maki and Toji. He can use his slashing attacks to guard against oncoming attacks. He is seemingly capable of attacking the soul directly and healing from attacks that target it, and certain forms of Sukuna that we've seen even wield a curse tool that can summon bolts of lightning. Now, all of these abilities are well and good and pretty fundamental to Sukuna's bag, but he has 3 main abilities in his arsenal that I would consider his most potent, most dangerous, and most effective. Those being the World Slash, Malevolent Shrine, and Furnace. The World Slash is simply his long-range slashing technique amplified by him chanting, signing, and aiming his attack in order to bypass the durability of his opponent. Its range and targeting is so precise that it was even able to get past Gojo's Infinity, one of the strongest defensive abilities I've ever witnessed in anime and manga. His domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine, allows him to swarm his enemies in an onslaught of unavoidable and lethal slashes that will continue until his enemy is either eviscerated or he ends the domain of his own volition. And once Dismantle and Cleave have stoked the fire of the furnace enough, Sukuna can bring out his fire arrow, which is essentially just a thermobaric bomb that will instantly hit his opponent and incinerate them without question. The fire arrow cannot be launched at will in the same way that the domain expansion, world slash, and regular dismantle and cleave can, at least not with the full speed and range of it being available to him, and it requires many slashes to land on his opponent and a domain to be expanded in order to use it to its fullest extent. With all of these abilities and a reserve of curse energy leagues beyond Yuta's with a control over it rivaling Gojo's, it's no surprise why Sukuna is Jujutsu Kaisen's big bad and the king of curses within his own universe. But now it's time to see how that title holds up to a bit of outside scrutiny. Is Sukuna's diverse array of hacks enough to contend with Muzan? Is the king of curses powerful enough to fight the Demon King? Well, right now is the time to answer that very question. Sukuna versus Muzan is an interesting and somewhat complex battle to discuss for a few reasons. For starters, the stat difference and how that plays into their dynamic in battle is something you have to constantly factor in when determining who wins this fight. Even when highballing Sukuna's speed and arguing that he's beyond a lightning timer, the degree to which he surpasses this speed doesn't compare to Muzan in the slightest. Not only is the lightning timer argument a highball in Sukuna's case, but even with that generosity being given, Demon Slayer characters are able to dodge lightning so much more casually that Muzan blitzing end of series Hashira means a lot more than Sukuna being faster than Akari and Kashimo. And when you look at the more reasonable and concrete Mach 25 to 50 scaling for Sukuna, this speed gap gets even worse. You could lowball Muzan as much as possible to get Sukuna and him to be much more comparable, but it's just not something that really makes sense in the grand scheme of things, and when looking at both of their most consistent speed showings, Muzan has a great advantage. Conversely, Muzan's attack potency, strength, and resilience just pale in comparison to Sukuna's. At his best, Muzan should be large town level, while city level Sukuna is an extremely reserved estimate for the character, with more appropriate and up-to-date arguments placing him all the way at island level, basically meaning that all of Sukuna's attacks will cut through Muzan like butter, and he'll have no trouble surviving the Demon King's abilities. On its own, this would make for a rather interesting battle that doesn't just come down to a glorified stat comparison, but Muzan's immunity to all attacks outside of direct sunlight means that while Sukuna can harm Muzan, killing him can only be accomplished by fighting until the sun is exposed, and Muzan is vulnerable to its effects. Now, there is technically another viable option for Sukuna depending on your interpretation of his abilities. However, the standard win con for both characters is as follows. Sukuna has to fight Muzan until the sun rises, and Muzan has to exhaust all of Sukuna's stamina, weakening him to the point to which he can actually do significant damage. A unique set of circumstances for both characters that really takes into account their tactics, previous experiences, and hacks. Muzan's healing factor that surpasses even the best in Jujutsu Kaisen, combined with his immortality during the night and unlimited stamina, would definitely push Sukuna in a unique way. However, Sukuna's invisible slashes, domain expansion, healing factor of his own, and large pool of energy would allow him to contend pretty well against Muzan, all things considered. So, with that being said, what's the outcome of this fight? Well, aside from actually setting the win cons, the first factor that is important to note in how this battle goes is stamina, namely Sukuna's. See, demons don't run out of energy, which means they can fight at their maximum ability forever, and this point has factored into many fights within Demon Slayer. We know that Sukuna doesn't literally have infinite stamina in the same way that Muzan does, based on his long gauntlet against the verse, which begs the obvious question of whether or not Sukuna would be able to fight against Muzan for an entire night straight without losing so much steam that Muzan's strength is enough to harm him. Well, based on the numerous statements and feats within the verse, I've determined that under the preset conditions, Sukuna should be able to maintain his curse energy levels and still have room to spare. This is because Sukuna has been stated, implied, and shown at numerous different points in the story to have cursed energy control rivaling Gojo's, a character who has been said to never run out of cursed energy under normal battle conditions. In chapter 233, Gojo himself says that Sukuna has to be relative to him in cursed energy manipulation in order to pull off the things he's doing in this fight. Couple that with them having equal domain refinement and Sukuna being able to open his domain countless times, even when functioning with only a portion of his normal energy, and there's absolutely no reason why Sukuna's stamina should be a problem in this fight. The comparison to Gojo is what really solidifies this as fact, because Gojo's stamina feats and statements are no joke. Gojo's refinement would allow him to power a country for an entire year. Yuta says that Gojo doesn't run out of cursed energy under normal circumstances. A weaker and less skilled Gojo was able to run his technique for 3 days straight, and in his prime, Gojo basically never turns off the Limitless. Sukuna's efficiency, even being remotely comparable to him, is enough to argue for his stamina, but he also has well over double the amount of cursed energy Satoru has. With it being clear that Sukuna has the endurance to participate in this fight for a while, the tactics of both fighters are now on the board, which is an entire discussion in itself. The speed advantage that Muzan possesses would basically negate most of Sukuna's attacks, especially all of his physical and visible ones. I could see Dismantle landing pretty regularly on Muzan considering he shouldn't be able to see them, but Muzan's healing factor is so advanced that the amount of damage he'd take in the long term is negligible, and once the surprise factor of invisible slices have worn off, Muzan is purely going to be on the offensive and just attack Sukuna with no real danger to himself until 2 key words are spoken: domain expansion. The one technique that Sukuna has at his disposal that eliminates any speed difference, the great equalizer in this fight, and one that makes the gap in strength between these two even larger. When using it in his default state, Muzan's skittish nature would make him prone to try to escape its range, which he could do with his superior speed and healing, but as shown in chapter 230, Sukuna can and is willing to close off his domain in order to seal away an opponent's option to run, something that Muzan would really have no counter for. It's possible that Sukuna would have to expend the cursed energy to use another domain expansion to figure this out, after having Muzan flee from the 200-meter range of his open barrier domain, but using the pinnacle of sorcery multiple times in one fight has never shown itself to be a problem for the King of Curses. After successfully trapping Muzan, Sukuna just has to keep his domain activated for the rest of the battle, as Muzan is torn apart and stitched back together over and over and over and over. And if Sukuna is feeling adventurous, I'm sure the slashes landing on Muzan in time would allow for him to launch the fire arrow and incinerate him, although I don't see that attack doing much more than extending the amount of time that it takes for Muzan to regenerate. Now, despite Sukuna being capable of fighting Muzan and keeping him at bay until the morning, it's pretty hard to say that he would come to the conclusion that the sun is the answer to defeating him without outside information. And if Sukuna does close off his barrier, then there's no way for the sunlight to directly hit Muzan. I could possibly see Muzan flexing and bragging after he realizes that Sukuna doesn't have a Nichiren blade, essentially proclaiming himself immortal unless the sun is present, but that's kind of up in the air and depends on how braggadocious you think Muzan is. If you think Sukuna is capable of figuring out that the sun is his weakness for whatever reason, or Muzan says this himself, then he wins pretty straight up. But if you think he's incapable, or Muzan himself wouldn't reveal this in his pompousness, then in all honesty, Sukuna simply doesn't have any conventional or straightforward means of defeating the Demon King. If we were talking about certain forms of Sukuna, namely Megana, then the use of Mahoraga would allow for him to adapt to Muzan's regenerative abilities and gain some new technique application that would make this effective. But that isn't the version of Sukuna being discussed today. If Sukuna continues to fight Muzan forever, eventually he'll get tired. Muzan won't, but he will, and this would result in an eventual Sukuna loss. In the scenario that Sukuna is incapable of inducing Muzan's weakness, the only remaining win con for Sukuna would be slashing Muzan's very soul, bypassing his conventional durability and healing factor, which we know he can do as he was able to harm Mahito very early on in the series. The fact he is capable of healing soul damage as well confirms spiritual awareness, further substantiating the potential for soul slashing attacks at his disposal. How in character it is for him to use it is ambiguous though, as it seems his normal slashes don't have soul damaging properties, as many characters are able to use RCT and recover from them. In Muzan's case, he really only has one win con against the King of Curses, and that's simply outlasting him. I talked about it briefly before, but regenerating endlessly shouldn't be a problem for Muzan, and despite Sukuna's likely near limitless reserves of energy due to his efficiency, we know that specific circumstances can cause his stamina to wane eventually. And the fact that he doesn't have literally infinite stamina means that no matter how long you think he can go, infinite is a lot more than almost infinite. If Muzan is able to shut down Sukuna's other win cons, keep his cards close to his chest, and make this purely a war of attrition, then, by all accounts, Muzan Kibutsuchi would be the victor of this fight. Now, while I did say that Sukuna only has 2 win cons, one being related to the soul slashes and the other being related to using the sun. That actually isn't quite true even when ignoring Mahoraga and adaptation as an option, because he still does possess the ability to make binding vows, something that fans of the story have realized that he really enjoys doing. If pushed far enough in this fight, similarly to how he felt against Gojo, I could see Sukuna making a binding vow that has the ability to permanently damage or incapacitate Muzan by expanding or restricting the target of his technique, much like Yuji has done in chapter 263. Limiting the range of his slashes to exclusively Muzan's soul, or even improving its efficacy against healing type characters in general by adding another requirement to his slashes, is within the realm of possibility for the character. He'd simply have to be pushed far enough to do so. In all honesty though, while no individual win con is certain for Sukuna, I think that the multitude of ways that he can win and potentially sway the odds in his favor supersedes the one endurance-based win con that Muzan has in his favor. Sukuna versus Muzan would definitely be a high difficulty fight for either character due to their opponent's trickiness, endurance, and general unknown abilities, but it's one that I find the King of Curses coming out on top in more often than not. This might be the least controversial video I've made in the Jujutsu Kaisen versus Demon Slayer style, because pretty much everyone agrees that Muzan should just lose, with I think like the only pushback I got just being that I seem to not make him lose hard enough. The most frequent comment given in favor of this idea was in regards to Sukuna's fire arrow just obliterating Muzan beyond his ability to regenerate, and I can get down with that. As I continue to make videos scaling both stories, I loosened my grip on the idea that it's Nichiren or nothing, and while Muzan would probably possess a Kari level regen or above that due to his speed, the fire arrow would so obviously atomize him before he can start healing that there's not much point in debating that. Obvious outdated domain scaling aside, Sukuna should still exist in these island levels of strength due to the calcs mentioned in this video, so that can remain pretty much the same. Funny how my most popular video on the matter of JJK versus Demon Slayer is also my least disagreed with, but hey, I'm not complaining. The final two topics of today's long gauntlet run are, funnily enough, gauntlet runs of their own, starting with Muzan versus Jujutsu Kaisen. Could Muzan solo Jujutsu Kaisen? As the almost strongest character in Demon Slayer, and an antagonist who serves a similar power scaling role in his verse as Sukuna to Jujutsu Kaisen, that is a question that piqued my interest. So today, as a follow-up to my video discussing how the disaster curses would fare against the upper moons, in this video I'll be analyzing and speculating on a hypothetical battle between Muzan and the entire cast of Jujutsu Kaisen. After briefly going over his physical capabilities and unique blood demon arts, I'll tackle a hypothetical Muzan raid in two parts. If Muzan were in a similar position as Sukuna, would he be capable of defeating the fighters present during the Shinjuku Showdown? And if he would be victorious, how would he fare against the world of Jujutsu Kaisen at large? First, let's assess Muzan's stats before throwing him into the gauntlet to see if his nearly undisputed reign in Demon Slayer can transfer to the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. As Demon Slayer's pinnacle of power, or at least something pretty close to it, scaling Muzan based on the feats of his thralls and numerous opponents is quite straightforward. With the exception of Yoriichi, anything accomplished within this manga is something that he too could achieve. Low-level Hashira like Kanroji, even before doing mark training in prep to fight Muzan himself, are capable of avoiding lightning strikes pretty consistently. And while the gap in strength pre- and post-training isn't exactly calculable, Muzan is capable of perception blitzing stronger versions of these characters on numerous occasions. In regards to his AP, Muzan vastly scales above all of his upper and lower ranked demons, some of which are able to completely obliterate and decimate areas like the Red Light District with their blood demon arts, which can be calced to be about large town level in terms of attack potency, and acts as a pretty solid ceiling for the verse, Muzan included. This level of power doesn't seem too far-fetched when you have characters like Doma just coughing out massive ice statues that require multi-city block levels of output to conjure, while experiencing a nearly fatal dose of poison and being inferior to Muzan even at his strongest. As is usually the case when scaling characters like this, Muzan's durability should at least be comparable to his attack potency, as he isn't immediately crushed or destroyed by the force of his own attacks. People like to note that Muzan took damage from this random explosion as a way to downplay his resilience, but forget that the gunpowder used in Demon Slayer is not only deemed to be specially equipped to harm demons, but was also lined with shrapnel meant to deal with them as well. It'd be like calling Superman bow and arrow level just because he can be pierced by arrows lined with kryptonite. Now, aside from these base physicals, Muzan has a plethora of techniques that include body modification and manipulation, shockwave creation, infinite stamina, ridiculous regeneration speed that floors lightning timers, and poisonous blood that he infuses into every one of his swings. I go much more in depth on Muzan's wide range of scaling potential based on how you interpret certain feats and statements in my Sukuna vs Muzan video, but what I've laid out here functions as a good baseline for his battle against Jujutsu Kaisen characters. Placing Muzan in the position of Sukuna and having him face the full might of a Gojo-less Jujutsu society breeds some fascinating results. Above all else, his insane healing factor, combat speed, and poisonous blood prove to be the most difficult things for these sorcerers to overcome. Even when being extremely generous to the cast and arguing that they peak as lightning timers based on characters like Kashimo and Hikari, the fact of the matter is that we've seen Muzan deal with and even perception blitz numerous characters who should scale pretty relatively to this level, meaning that the sheer enormity of assailants and their speed isn't likely to overcome Muzan's ability to respond and react. Add to this his healing factor that is so integral to demons, which was so quick that for a time the Hashira were under the impression that their swords were just passing through him, and you have a supremely fast, nigh unkillable demon that will never tire and endlessly pursue you. This means lower level characters that we're fighting against Sukuna like Choso and Ino won't be able to do all that much, but top tiers like Yuji, Yuta, Maki, and Hikari should be more than capable of surviving Muzan's initial onslaught due to multiple feats and calculations making their durability at least comparable to Muzan's output. Yuta surviving multiple granite blasts from Ishigori, who is feats calc to be small town level, should be applicable to his fellow heavy hitters, as they're all narratively implied to be within the same realm for one reason or another. You could argue that they should be even a bit higher than this based on the results of their time skip training leading up to the Shinjuku Showdown, but the increase here isn't really quantifiable. Much like the Hashira and their mark training, the increase here is implied to be significant, but not rooted in enough objective information to pull any crazy increases or multipliers from. In any case, the real MVPs of Shinjuku Showdown plus Hikari, through a mix of their own healing abilities and enhanced durability, should be capable of surviving many strikes from Muzan without fear of death. That being said, just because his strikes wouldn't possess enough kinetic energy to tear them to shreds like Sukuna slices doesn't mean that they're in the clear. The problem with Muzan doesn't actually come from the tentacles themselves. What will prove to be most lethal is his poisonous blood, something that he injects into every single one of his attacks, and a poison so deadly that it's able to completely incapacitate foes in just a few minutes. Hikari, while in Jackpot, should be able to get around this due to his autonomous RCT, but as shown in his fight with Kashimo, even he requires some time to filter the toxins out of his system in order to get back to fighting at top speed. So the dozens of attacks he and all of his allies are guaranteed to take may very well overwhelm him. This effect becomes even more exacerbated in Maki and Yuta's cases. Yuta possesses RCT, sure, and you might even be able to argue in favor of Yuta having a high enough level of proficiency to wager that he can heal poisons, but Maki's healing doesn't imply that she has a great way of dealing with things like this, and even in the event Yuta can heal from poison, spamming RCT every time he takes an attack will only drain his stamina faster and essentially eliminate him as a threat in this battle. Yuji actually fares the best when it comes to dealing with Muzan's poisons, as we know that he has an insane resistance that actually borders on a complete immunity to the greatest toxins in the verse. This means with the exception of Yuji and Hikari, as well as maybe someone like Shoso due to his own blood having a poisonous effect, Muzan has a clear win con assuming he peppers every sorcerer with his poison and survives long enough for it to finish them off. As a condition to win, this is Muzan's most consistent and most likely. Now, does this mean that he just completely wipes the anti-Sukuna squad with no level of resistance? No, not exactly. As it typically does in cross-verse battles, the domain expansion functions as the great equalizer. An enclosed space that would allow for a particular sorcerer to bombard Muzan with 120% of their full power without fear of avoidance, paired with multiple unique abilities and conditions, adds a layer of complexity to this battle's outcome. And the fact that Muzan's poison does take a few minutes to take effect means that certain characters might be able to get something off and deal some real lasting damage to him. Yuta, Yuji, Maki, Higuruma, and I guess Takaba all pose threats to Muzan's life in some way or another quite directly. I personally rarely include Takaba in conversations like this, mainly because the limitations and applications of this technique are ambiguous, but the comedian definitely is a viable way to disrupt Muzan's flow, and in the most extreme examples might outright erase him from existence. Outside of this, weapons like Soul Split Katana should be capable of circumventing Muzan's healing factor, as soul-based regeneration is never an ability put on display by him. This would be an amazing help in slowing his movements and consistently weakening him. However, due to the nature of Maki's fighting style and her inferior stats, finishing the job this way seems unlikely unless she pulls off some Toji-esque sneak attack on him. It is here where our domains are their most important. Allowing someone like Higuruma to open the fight with his barrier almost guarantees confiscation and the death penalty taking place. What confiscation would look like in Muzan's case, I'm not sure. Maybe he'd lose access to his demon arts, or maybe nothing occurs as there is no true curse technique analog for demons. Regardless of this fact, the Executioner's Sword would be in play, and thus the capacity to instantly kill Muzan Kibutsuchi is introduced to the scenario. If paired with Yuta, Yuji, Todo, Maki, and Hikari in an all-or-nothing mad dash to get one slash in on him, I can genuinely see this scenario taking place, in contrast to how it played out against Sukuna. Not only is Muzan less of a tactical genius than him, being far less privy to the wily ways of sorcerers, but we see him get slashed by opponents a blitz level difference below him because the only thing he truly fears are the sun and those who can harness its power through unique breathing techniques. It's very possible that Higuruma sustains numerous injuries in order to get in a single poke, or even tosses the blade to one of his stronger allies to allow them to finish things, combined with Todo's refined and improved Boogie Woogie. It's a far cry from a certain victory, as Muzan's feat is extremely crazy relative to theirs, but it's a feasible outcome nonetheless. A similar thing can be said for Yuta and Yuji's domains landing, although it requires you to interpret some of their abilities and Muzan's resistance in pretty wacky ways. Yuji's soul targeting slashes might be capable of severing Muzan if you think the strength he's accrued from all the humans he's eaten and the power of his upper moons that he wields is quite similar in nature to Sukuna's bond with Megami. This is merely my interpretation of how Itadori's technique could interact with him, but if you find this implausible, I can't really be mad at you, as it's kind of hard to compare this one-to-one. In any case, just having Shrine do physical damage to him constantly within his domain does give the sorcerers a leg up regardless, meaning that expanding Malevolent Shrine would probably be to his benefit. Mutual and Authentic Love is in a similar boat, as it has the potential to kill Muzan with Jacob's Ladder, at least if it has an effect on Muzan similar to that as the sun, but that's quite reliant on you assuming Muzan's biological makeup is similar to that of an incarnated sorcerer, when you kind of like equalize the verses. If you're particularly generous to Akotsu but don't believe in the Jacob's Ladder argument, you might even be able to argue in favor of a domain amped, max output curse speech attack with it set as the domain sure hit effect, potentially taking him out. Muzan's lack of cursed energy certainly makes it difficult to speculate on Yuta's capacity to simply tell him to die, but just like everything else listed, I think it's at least possible that he does some lasting damage with an attack like this. Speaking of cursed energy, there's a massive Maharaga-sized elephant in the room that I do think needs addressing since we're talking about domains. Characters in Demon Slayer have no cursed energy, and does Muzan's innate lack of cursed energy mean that he would simply be ignored by the barriers and sure hit effects present within all of these characters' domain expansions? And the answer to that question is yes. In the Demon Slayer universe, cursed energy doesn't exist, nor does any aura system that would naturally be its equivalent. Objectively, this would mean that Muzan would function like a heavenly restriction user, like Toji or Maki, rather than a sorcerer or even a regular human. Which, quick aside, people always reply in the comments to these videos saying that normal humans don't have cursed energy, but like, they do. They just can't control it and don't have all that much. That's why you see those random Shibuya residents getting absolutely brain blasted by Gojo's infinite void. But in any case, if you strictly adhere to this valid line of logic that no cursed energy in Demon Slayer means no cursed energy for Muzan, then he would remain unaffected by domains and beats the anti-Sukuna squad 10 out of 10 times. Without the ability to tie him down and guarantee attacks landing, then they are absolutely fried. However, I'm personally of the opinion that hypothetical matchups like this require a little bit of pizzazz, or at least should encourage some level of creative liberties. We assume Muzan can see and harm curses as well as Jujutsu-based attacks in order for the battle to take place in the first place. And in a similar way, I like to presume some level of domain efficacy unless extenuating circumstances apply, or the character has an explicit reason as to why they would not be included within a barrier. In the event that we do assume domains work, the scale tips in favor of the anti-Sukuna squad just a bit. I mean, just think about every battle in JJK where a domain is utilized first. 9 times out of 10, it's a massive momentum shifter. And that's almost always against characters who are aware of that possibility, as well as potentially possessing counters for it. Against an outsider with no knowledge like Muzan, this surprise factor becomes even more potent. His greatest saving grace in this instance is that most domains owned by the anti-Sukuna squad don't represent the pinnacle of lethality in the same way some sorcerers do outside of this group. The only domain discussed today with a bulletproof way to kill Muzan is Higuruma's, but due to the nature of the death sentence being carried out physically, Muzan's greater speed should allow him to evade this attack under most normal circumstances. Whether or not he is nicked by this blade and subsequently killed rests solely on the sorcerer's cunning and Muzan's lack of knowledge about the severity of this attack. Without either of these coming into play, Muzan be able to evade them endlessly. If he is vulnerable to Itadori's soul-severing slashes or Jacob's ladder for the aforementioned reasons, I do see the chances of the sorcerers coming out on top increasing. Having more immediate, numerous, and subtle forms of taking the Demon King out gives them much more than the snowball chance in hell that I've been discussing for them thus far. The main focus of this video thus far has been questioning Muzan's performance if he were in the shoes of Sukuna, but when throwing him to the wolves, addressing and discussing other potential threats to him seems appropriate. As established, when going over how Muzan fares in a fight against the anti-Sukuna squad, it's fair to assume that in most of these battles, he'll have an overwhelming speed advantage, attack potency capable of harming most sorcerers and curses, and the regenerative ability to win a prolonged bout. This means in order to compete with him, one must possess a very powerful domain, a unique curse technique, or the explicit attack potency that would allow them to completely obliterate him in one shot, taking the possibility of regen off the table. One group of characters that comes to mind when contemplating these conditions is the cluster of disaster curses. All of them possess ridiculous wells of cursed energy, passive regeneration, insane attack potency, and most importantly to this discussion, domain expansions with lethal sure hit effects. Without the increased technique potency and auto-locking provided by their barriers, curses on the lower levels of this group, like Dagon and Hanami, likely don't pose that much of a threat to Muzan. Dagon specifically would in no way be fast enough to compete with Muzan's tendril attacks, and in all likelihood would be worn down Toji style if he didn't open his domain. I can certainly see his Fish Shikigami prolonging a battle with Muzan, as he'd genuinely have no way of defending himself from the full scope of the sea, but Dagon's energy well would eventually run dry, and none of the techniques shown lead me to believe he'd be capable of just obliterating Muzan in a single strike, domain or no. The outcome is quite similar for Hanami, although I do think she fares a tad bit better. Her buds could drain Muzan's life force if they're able to connect, and while we don't see it in effect, Hanami does have access to a massive solar beam that can be paired with her domain. Its attack potency, range, and scale is a bit dubious, though. We know that she thought it'd be capable of obliterating Goodwill, Todo, and Yuji, but they in no way scaled to the high tiers of the verse needed to establish a one-shot range. So even if the charge time is allotted and the technique lands, it's very possible that it just takes a chunk out of Muzan and he regenerates before wearing her down as well. The two most promising prospects of this group are Mahito and Jogo, as they tend to be. Mahito's here for obvious reasons. His invulnerability to conventional attacks makes all of Muzan's flailing a fruitless endeavor. Pair that with his domain's ability to warp and distort the soul, and Mahito's win condition becomes as clear as day. Get absolutely blitzed repeatedly by Muzan until he realizes he can't hit him, then just go ahead and, pop his domain. Even with his pretty overpowered regeneration, Muzan would have no way of recovering from Idle Transfiguration, as the technique literally warps your soul to take on a different form, rather than inflict some vague level of damage upon you. In Jogo's case, a win is possible, but a bit more contentious. While much faster than Dagon and Hanami, he would still be nowhere near quick enough to contend with Muzan in a pure contest of speed. And after getting slashed up for a while, opening his domain would be an absolute necessity. The only way I don't see this playing out properly is if Jogo, in his arrogance, doesn't pop a domain for whatever reason, but I don't imagine him applying that post-Sukuna in Gojo domain fear to someone that doesn't even really have cursed energy like that. Cutting speed out of the equation with Coffin of the Iron Mountain would allow him to use maximum meteor with no fear of Muzan avoiding this attack, and based on the tremors and damage shown in Shibuya, This has been calculated to be about a multi-city block level feat. Enough to damage him maybe, but certainly not enough firepower to outright incinerate him if need be. All hope isn't lost for Jogo though, as in the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook, Maximum Meteor is stated to be able to turn a town to dust and ash. Assuming this is in reference to, the average Japanese town, and Jogo is actually vaporizing it, this would be a small country level feat, which should be more than enough to incinerate Muzan in a single blow based on what we've seen him capable of in the story. Now, in hearing that, you might wonder why destroying a town makes us attack small country level when taken literally. But the logic is like this. Say Mike Tyson punches you in the ribs. Obviously, your ribs and internal organs are going to do the Macarena inside of your body, and you probably will die. That means, Mike Tyson, he's human level, right? Let's say I punch you in the ribs, and then you turn into dust. My punch would be stronger despite you meeting God in both scenarios, because the violence and thoroughness of the destruction capacity is what gives that feat the scaling, and this is what applies to Maximum Meteor and makes it so potentially potent. So while I think that Jogo has a much rougher go of it than Mahito, as he'd actually be taking damage that he needs to heal, Jogo's domain and immense firepower certainly allows for victory over the Demon King in the right circumstances. Another character that potentially has the ability to one-shot Muzan is Yorozu, who finds herself in a pretty similar situation to Jogo, albeit slightly worse as she doesn't have a known healing factor. Just like every other JJK character, she's far too slow to land any of her attacks outside of a domain and should be susceptible to his poison, meaning that in a physical confrontation, she'd find herself quite pressed. But if she can open her domain and land Perfect Sphere, she would just completely eliminate the threat altogether. It's definitely more of a toss-up due to the poison playing a much bigger factor for her, but due to her domain, she does have a chance. Now, every character and every scenario I've laid out here relies on a domain being used and actually landing effectively. So does this mean JJK characters are domain merchants that can't beat Muzan without them? Yeah, kinda. For the most part, JJK characters do need domains in order to eliminate the advantage that the gap in speed brings, but there are at least 2 characters, 3 if you're counting Takaba again, that can beat Muzan without using domains. The first is Gojo, who, I know, for obvious reasons doesn't have to worry about Muzan's poison or speed. The elimination of a domain from his arsenal would make landing shots difficult, but taking damage isn't going to be an issue, and while Infinite Void would be the most straightforward method of handling him, Gojo does have another option. An omnidirectional, unlimited Hollow Purple would likely be enough to catch Muzan unaware, especially when he doesn't understand all of the conditions for Gojo's techniques. The great thing for Gojo as well is that he doesn't have to rush to this conclusion either. He too has unwavering stamina and a high battle IQ that would allow him to accurately assess the situation and act accordingly. The only other character that I can think of to defeat Muzan without a domain is Mahoraga, the ever-evolving Shikigami of the 10 Shadows. While we don't see it adapt to purely physical stat differentials, it'd be more than capable of growing immune to Muzan's poison and tendrils and begin to dish out blows of its own that can't be healed, possibly even changing the properties of its body to mimic that of a red Nichiren blade or lethal dose of wisteria flowers. We also know Mahoraga can fling imperceptible projectiles as its adaptation furthers, allowing it to phase Muzan out of this battle over time. Now, if Muzan is aware of Mahoraga's adaptation, he might be able to pool all of his strength together into one massive blow to one-shot it, but otherwise, he'd just get adapted to over and over and over until he no longer possesses the ability to effectively attack or defend. So the answer to the question, could Muzan solo Jujutsu Kaisen, is a resounding and pretty confident no. While he possesses speed and hacks that provide serious problems for nearly every tier of Jujutsu Kaisen character, the efficacy of domains and very specific curse techniques do allow for some individuals or group of sorcerers and curses to overwhelm him. Another pretty uncontroversial video, all things considered. I'm sure some of it is just good presentation, but Muzan really does not have any positive rep within the Demon Slayer community, and y'all just do not go to bat for this guy. I find it so funny. The only thing I think I could be faulted for in this video is not including Miwa and the many ways she dispatched Muzan, but I just figured you guys would understand something so basic. In any case, we have one more video till we can arrive at a proper verdict to this discussion. So let's dive right into it with Sukuna versus the Demon Slayer universe. The world of Demon Slayer is very cruel and unforgiving, and with Tanjiro and his fellow Slayers facing their hardest challenges yet in the Infinity Castle arc, I thought, why not make their lives even harder and throw Sukuna into the world of Demon Slayer to see how he'd fare. If you watch my previous videos covering Muzan vs Jujutsu Kaisen and the Disaster Curses versus the Upper Moons, you know how the structure of this discussion will play out. First, I'll give a brief scaling of Sukuna in a few of his most iconic forms to give you a sense for his strength, before following up by pitting him up against the Hashira, and later, the entirety of Demon Slayer. Scaling Sukuna's stats relative to his contemporaries is quite a straightforward endeavor because he is essentially peerless. With the exception of Gojo, Sukuna is far and away the physically fastest and strongest in the verse. This means low-end speed feats like Yuji and Arame reacting to piercing blood, an ability stated to surpass the speed of sound, or casual reactions to gunfire that several sorcerers are able to avoid or directly counter, all link back to and scale to him. This gives him a solid floor, being pretty casually supersonic as he's able to blitz pretty much the entire cast beyond their ability to perceive him, even while being significantly weakened himself after fighting the second strongest sorcerer of all time. In terms of direct high-end calculations, we see Sukuna make a mockery of piercing blood on a couple of occasions, making the attack look like a statue in one instance, and narrowly dodging from point-blank range in another. A pretty consistent ability for top tiers, as Kenjaku performed similarly against Choso in previous chapters. This would place him in a range anywhere from 30 to 60 times the speed of sound in a pretty nerfed state. The highest you can reasonably place someone like Sukuna is that lightning timer range though, based purely off the fact that he's able to perception blitz characters that should be within the same general range of speed as Akari, who seems to be able to visually register Kashimo's lightning strikes, if not completely avoid them outright. With 15 fingers of his power, he completely blitzed Ishigori, who could go blow for blow with Akotsu, who's pretty consistently placed in the same heavy hitter weight class as Akari and Maki. Strength-wise, Sukuna's regular strikes and basic slashes should exist in the town to large town level range. We see that Arame is able to spawn in massive structures of ice in seconds, and the calculated output required for this would place them in that town range. Sukuna, for obvious reasons, scales above Arame here. Gojo's unsealing creates an earthquake that can be felt despite him being sealed 8,000 meters below the surface, and I see no reason for Gojo just ascending to go beat Kenjaku's ass would result in consistently greater force in his amplified punches, kicks, and energy blast meant to take down his strongest foe. Sukuna's ultimate move should be in an entirely different echelon, and we can say this with a level of certainty because of a statement regarding Jogo's maximum meteor. In the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook, it said that Jogo could vaporize a town and reduce it to ash and cinder. Completely disintegrating a structure this large would actually be a large country level feat, believe it or not. And not only should Sukuna's fire arrow have a higher ceiling, but it's implied that this attack wouldn't even kill Sukuna, as Jogo would be satisfied with some vague amount of damage, and Sukuna himself confirms this. Destroying a town and getting country levels of strength may seem counterintuitive and downright dumb, but I want you to think about it like this. If I had prime Mike Tyson punch you in the chest, he'd probably shatter your ribcage, and let's be honest, you're gonna go see God. However, just because I throw a punch at you, turn you to dust, and the end result is death in both instances, doesn't really mean the levels of power generated are the same. It requires exponentially more energy to reduce a structure to ash than it does to merely fragment, level, or vaguely destroy it. And the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook is pretty specific with its wording here. In any case, Sukuna's maximum durability should be capable of surviving a blow from this attack, although that's likely only something he could achieve by intentionally reinforcing his body with curse energy and purely focusing on defense, somewhat similar to how he defended against a hollow purple. As a baseline, he should probably exist around those large town levels of durability with no extra conditions. In regards to his hacks, Sukuna in most forms is pretty straightforward. He cuts, and he cuts a lot. In his true form, he has the benefit of additional limbs to aid him in combat, a curse tool that generates lightning, and the capacity to use his world-cutting slash, an ability that bypasses all conventional durability. On top of this, he has the ability to heal and is home to some of the greatest healing feats in the verse, not only being able to restore his damaged brain, but in a healthy state would even be able to do so for his soul. His excellent cursed energy control grants him 6 Eyes-esque stamina management, which will definitely make him a hassle to wear down. While in Megami's body he would possess the 10 Shadows, The most notable Shikigami being Maharaga, with its ability to adapt to any and all phenomena, and this would just generally give Sukuna a wider array of abilities and ways to attack the Demon Slayer universe. His ace in the hole in any body is the combination of Malevolent Shrine and Fuga being used in tandem, which is sure to incinerate anyone that his slashes can't. With all that being said, Sukuna's performance against the Hashira, while equally dominant to Muzan's, most likely plays out a bit differently for a few reasons. The first and most prominent is speed. While Sukuna is pretty generously faster than lightning if you interpret a few moments with a bit of goodwill, the same can be said for the Hashira even before they grow over the course of Infinity Castle. Kanroji is able to evade multiple lightning strikes, not only being one of the weaker Hashira herself, but also accomplishing this before the mark training and in-battle amps received by pretty much every character we're discussing right now. They've also demonstrated the ability to fight against characters significantly faster than themselves by relying on their own instincts and a little bit of luck, which does mean that Sukuna is unlikely to blitz or overwhelm them all through sheer speed like Muzan was capable of. Their vaguely town-level striking ability also means that the mid to high tier Hashira should be capable of damaging Sukuna with their attacks. These facts, combined with the knowledge that the Hashira are elite swordsmen capable of fighting alongside each other with great proficiency, means that Sukuna would not exactly have an easy go of things. Where problem starts to arise, however, is with Sukuna's curse technique. Of the Hashira, you could argue that Gyu and Gyome would have something in their arsenal that would allow them to detect or disperse large portions of the damage that comes with an armada of slashes, but even that is a bit dubious, as characters within JJK with extra sensory abilities like the Six Eyes seemingly still can't perceive Sukuna's attacks. Inosuke and Gyome's detection of ill intent, Gyu's 11th water form, and Tanjiro's enhanced sense of smell, as well as the see-through world, might give them a leg up in evading Sukuna's slashes, but everyone outside of this is getting torn to shreds by attacks that exceed their durability and would mitigate their battle power consistently. We see in Demon Slayer that the loss of a limb can take a Hashira level combatant out of that tier entirely, and since none of these characters possess any kind of healing factor, they'd just be fighting an ever-losing battle. One could argue that the see-through world would allow for the slashes to be perceptible, but this is such an inconsistent technique for the Hashira to tap into outside of Tanjiro that it wouldn't do much but delay the inevitable. In contrast, Sukuna can take on loads and loads of damage and just pretend it never happened with reverse curse technique, but the Hashira will continuously weaken and die off, only making his job easier. This is ignoring his higher tier techniques like his Domain and Fire Arrow, which would immediately one-shot any character they came into contact with. And due to his Domain targeting inanimate objects as well, even if you do make the point that the Hashira would possess no cursed energy, it wouldn't matter as the slashes would come for them all the same. The Slayers could potentially defeat Sukuna if a coordinated blitz attempt to decapitate him occurs before he starts sending out slashes, which would technically be possible due to their speed advantages, but it's kind of unlikely due to Sukuna being more durable than any individual Hashira's attack potency, and this not exactly being an in-character strike attempt from them. His laid-back attitude could allow for this to happen maybe 2 times out of 10 if you beam knowledge of the fight beforehand into all of the Hashira's brains, but I just don't see it being a very likely occurrence when he's capable of just decimating them with attacks a majority of them can't even perceive. And aside from that strategy, no one really has a way to put him in the ground for good here. Even something more roundabout like Shinobu's poison wouldn't work due to it being specifically made to counter demons. And even if this wasn't the case, the king of toxins and top tier RCT user should have no trouble neutralizing its poisonous effects. So it's clear that the Hashira alone aren't enough to get the job done. With no hope of stalling until the sun comes up, the inability to kill him with poison, and his specific combination of hacks, fighting style, and attack potency, it doesn't look too good for them. But what about the demons of the Demon Slayer universe? While their sets shouldn't be significantly greater than that of the Hashira, they do have unique advantages that the humans aren't able to tap into, the greatest being their regenerative factors and infinite stamina. With both of these on their side, even without the ability to perceive Sukuna's slashes, higher ranking demons should be capable of putting up a better fight against him. Certain demons like Enmu, Gyoko, and Nakime have blood demon arts with properties that could give Sukuna some trouble as well, much more than any individual breathing style has the capacity to. Enmu, for example, would be able to place Sukuna in a dreamlike state, leaving his subconscious vulnerable to destruction, as well as physical body at the mercy of all the other demons. The only issue with this is that Sukuna displays a pretty high tolerance for attacks that attempt to affect his mental or spiritual state, as Mahito's idol transfiguration is able to be countered by Sukuna's mere presence. He also doesn't have the sentimentality necessary to make him refrain from offing himself in an obvious dream sequence, and just return to the fight. Gyoko has a myriad of poisons and toxins that should be more applicable to Sukuna here than the Wisteria poison, but his RCT should be more than capable of handling it, and his proficiency with cursed energy guarantees his energy pool remains even if he's running it continuously. Honestly, the most aggravating demon to fight would probably be Nakame, simply because her creation and manipulation of the Infinity Castle would interfere in Sukuna's efforts to slaughter them all, and also protect them from the light of the sun. He could get around this by sending slashes she can't perceive, or potentially even bring her into a clash of domains, separating her from everyone else on the battlefield, but she's an annoying combatant nonetheless. I mentioned these three characters despite their lackluster physical showings because their unique abilities present much more of an issue than pretty straightforward fighters like Akaza, Doma, and Kokushibo, despite these three being the most powerful upper moons. Even with the limitation of not being able to kill them without a Nichiren blade or with the sun, the domain plus fire arrow combo should be able to solve that problem, as it allows him to bypass the need for either of these by completely annihilating the demons in one shot. Things become even easier if we're talking about a version of Sukuna who has Maharaga in tow, as this would allow him to develop Nichiren-like properties over time that can permanently put these demons down. The only character who I can feasibly see defeating Sukuna is Yoriichi. I go into depth on how I see a Sukuna and Muzan showdown playing out in this video, so I won't go into too much depth on it here, but even if you assume Sukuna is a step above that level, it doesn't immediately place him above the greatest demon slayer of all time. Constant use of the see-through world, seemingly boundless stamina, enough power to casually chop off Muzan's head, and speed that overshadows everything else in the verse, Yoriichi is by far the greatest opponent that Sukuna could face within this universe. Let me give you a bit of perspective here if you're not sold yet. Sukuna's speed feats would place him on a level comparable to Kanroji before getting a training power-up. Kanroji isn't able to react to attacks that higher level Hashira like Gyome can. Gyome can get perception blitzed by Kokushibo. Muzan is incomparably stronger, faster, more durable, and an overall more dangerous combatant than any of his upper moons. And Yoriichi perception blitzed and bullied Muzan to the point of having PTSD that spanned centuries. Neither Sukuna nor his slashes have any hope of landing outside of a domain expansion here. The gap in speed is astronomical. It's even hard to wrap my head around as someone who has the knowledge on this. And I'm truly inclined to believe that Yoriichi would be capable of severing Sukuna's head from his body before he's able to make an offensive move. And due to Yoriichi's somewhat stoic nature, I even see this being the most likely option for him. The gap in strength, and most importantly, gap in speed, is that great. Now, don't get me wrong, Dismantle, Cleave, World Cutting Slash, Domain Expansion, Fire Arrow, if any of these things land, they pretty much spell instant defeat for Yoriichi, but that's only if it hits. The longer the battle goes on, the greater chance Sukuna has of pouring his energy into his defenses and domain to shred Yoriichi, but whoever makes the first major move wins, and Yoriichi can make a dozen different slashes before Sukuna even recognizes what's going on. The only way you can argue Sukuna survives an encounter with the greatest demon slayer is if his durability more casually sits at those country levels of strength required to not instantly perish from Jogo's max meteor. No demon slayer character, Yoriichi included, has demonstrated AP feats anywhere near this tier of strength, which would prevent Sukuna's head from flying in the initial rush and allow for time to open his domain. Personally, I think this is only a level of durability that intentional reinforcement can achieve, something that Sukuna would have to put his conscious effort into doing, which wouldn't happen before the Blitz. Depending on your interpretation of certain feats and statements though, this fight would either end in an instant or result in even the most blessed character in the entire Demon Slayer story falling to Malevolent Shrine. So with this matchup, more than an outpour of comments that disagreed with me, I think the main problem with this video at least was that I downplayed Sukuna just a bit, primarily in the durability and attack potency department, as well I said his upper limits should scale well beyond what Demon Slayer characters are capable of. What I should have taken into consideration were feats and calcs like Gojo's pretty casual earthquake creation after getting unsealed to get a better baseline for the character's durability. It's safe to assume that Gojo probably just spammed his curse technique a few times to get past the subduction zone where the prison realm was located, and Sukuna survives, while not outright tanking, every attack that Gojo can throw at him, even when he's somewhat caught off guard, like in the instance of Gojo's red-black flash combination landing. Because of this, he could probably do a much better job of tanking Yorichi's slashes more casually than I had initially presumed. I still do believe that due to the nature of curse energy having to be applied instead of being passive, Yorichi's massive speed advantage allows him to have a chance to pull off a crazy reversal of odds. I just think that this chance is much less likely than I had initially portrayed it in the video, making Sukuna's tear through the universe that much worse, or better, depending on who you're rooting for. So that just leaves the question, Jujutsu Kaisen versus Demon Slayer, verse versus verse. Jesus, talk about a mouthful. Which is stronger? A common trend throughout all of these matchups was that the Demon Slayer characters are pound for pound significantly faster than their Jujutsu Kaisen counterparts, and up until the top tiers, they can even reach comparable levels of strength. Because of this stat split, battles between characters can get pretty damn close or be back and forth in terms of who wins video to video. I'd even go so far as to say that in the mid or low upper tiers of strength, Demon Slayer characters and just the verse in general is more capable to an extent, but they just completely lose out when going against the higher tiers. As demonstrated in Muzan and Sukuna's respective raid through the opposing series, Muzan gets taken out by several characters in JJK, while Sukuna only potentially loses to one. And despite being the strongest in-universe, this doesn't even take into account someone like Gojo, who has better abilities to use in cross-verse battles. I would say that in covering many different iterations of the series, going at it and fighting, looking at different abilities and how they apply and counteract each other, it's much closer of a matchup than most would give credit for, but Jujutsu Kaisen is the stronger and more versatile universe of the two at the end of the day. If you made it all the way to the end, I appreciate you, and let me know if you'd like to see more of these massive series versus series videos on the channel more often. They're super fun to make and come back to, and I have plenty of series that I could make this format work with. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.